Okay, I think we're connected to YouTube.
Oh my God, it's working. It's working.
Well, don't say yeah.
Yeah, okay, man.
Ah, gorge.
So is that the stream?
Yep.
Beautiful.
Stevie, you're amazing.
Oh, I don't know about that, but thank you.
Well, let's say this one, like freaking second and none.
The thing that I'm kind of confused about is, I guess, like, I'm just worried if I leave the meeting, it's a little message.
Yeah, I think you can't leave the meeting
Well, should we connect?
unless you make
laptop?
somebody else the.
I mean, I have
I-
Megan set as co-host. I can just make her the host, I guess.
I still worry that you can leave the meeting.
Can I get you off?
Right?
But I also don't want to be here for
And it's
3 hours when I can do other stuff. Okay, so Megan, you said that you have like control of pinning and all that, so you're good. Okay. And I think on here, I might still have us muted, but otherwise. Have us muted. Here, I might still have us. Oh, that's me. A little bit of a delay. The live stream is just showing that screen right now, since you have that up.
Okay.
So that's like what it looks like on YouTube, just so you know.
Oh, perfect.
So this, like what is on the screen is what is here, and then there's just a little window
Okay,
of the room itself.
okay, perfect.
So that's good, because that means the screen will be what people see as I guess they're talking. Wow.
First of all, we had like 5 months.
Does everything look good here?
Is that?
Does everything look good on your end?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
So,
I think things are, they look very stable too, which is good.
Okay. I like stable.
And it's recording, so that's good.
It's recording? Okay, perfect. We gotta make friends with the media department so then they could do a little bit
I
of.
can't seem to make,
Oh,
see, I think you might still be the only person who can make people co-hosts. I think it's because you have like the main host control.
So
who are you
you
trying
want
to,
to make somebody else co-host?
Yeah, it's not allowing,
because I might be, who is it that you're trying to make a host?
See, here's the host.
right, all of the speakers, so that way if they have,
So, yeah,
So-
they had to do it.
unless you want to transfer,
And I was up
well-
till,
you want,
kind of watching some of it.
I
and,
have checked, I can do
you know,
pinning.
it was-
do you want, should I make
But I
you your
cannot
the 2 minutes one a co-host?
It is a co-host already,
Oh, okay, gotcha.
so I can pin, I can do all of those things, but I just cannot.
got- I'll make
Yeah, I mean, if you did,
Joseph Cordova co-host. Who else is on our first?
First panel.
I had,
He's the only one here, I think so.
Yeah, Kathleen, I thought I saw Kathleen,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah, she
Kath-
is.
oh,
Kathleen,
very smart.
Misha,
Oh, I was.
Sylvia, and Amada.
Yeah, neither of them yet, but I got Katie and Joseph.
Yeah, I know everybody has that slide. Yeah.
Let me continue with it.
Do we want to have students closer? Or-
Well, I know.
Amada just got here.
Just looking for one more then.
Okay, she's co-host now.
Oh, I don't know, it's my nerves.
Bring tequila, sorry.
Next time.
That's for after.
I hate that happens
There we
every
go.
go to it, because,
Yeah,
yeah.
there we go. Well, that's the thing.
I gotta take
Great.
that.
Listen, you're just gonna, you're really gonna crash at the end of all this.
No,
You're like 5 minutes.
I am, yeah. Me and my, so I've got 3 guys now in my little group. The whole rest of IS is at home.
Yeah.
Right, but I worked from home for maybe 2 months, 2 years ago,
Number out there.
and then I just
Good afternoon, presenters. We are going to try to moderate the time. And so when we have at the 2-minute point, we were gonna log in as a 2-minute. You will see it as almost a person. As you see everyone's name on your computers, it will come up a name very closely. You'll be able to see, and I'll say 2 minutes. So that's the way we're trying to notify the presenters that you're at the 2-minute mark of your presentation. So just wanted to give that as a heads up. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Dr. Megan Alderden, Chair of the Criminology Department here at DePaul University, and I get the pleasure and honor to welcome you today for what I know will be a thought-provoking discussion that explores the intersection of criminal justice and immigration. I hope you're able to attend both panels. I know there'll be a great discussion. Before turning it over to Dr. Perez, I always think it's important to express my gratitude to all those who help make events like this happen. I would like to thank our colleagues in the Departments of Latin American and Latino Studies and Refugee and Forced Migration Studies and the Center for Latino Research here at DePaul University, along with our esteemed panelists for sharing their time and talent with us. I would also like to express my appreciation to Dr. Vecchio, who so willingly offered to help host a panel during his class time and even changed his course syllabus to accommodate this event, which is a big thing for a professor. Stephen Reese, who consistently, reliably, and without complaint provides support to our department. Greg Barker, who we apparently roped in to help us with some Zoom technical assistance. And then, of course, a special heartfelt thanks to the architect of today's event, Dr. Xavier Perez. His sweat, stress, and maybe some tears helped pull together what I know will be amazing discussion. with experts from all over the United States. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce the amazing Dr. Prince.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you to the panelists who are in attendance in different time zones. Thank you for accommodating hours and meeting with us here in the Midwest. I appreciate and forever feel indebted to you. Let me start with a bit of just a very brief introduction of what our goal is today. So good morning, students, colleagues, community activists, and everyone who is attending this important event. Thank you for participating in this national discussion and surrounding intersection of criminal justice and immigration, also known as Crimmigration. We assemble panelists who work in different capacities to resist the dehumanizing process associated with immigration in this country. For several decades, we observed the punitive policies associated with the criminal justice system slowly transform how immigrants are treated in the US. The panelists would examine past and current immigration policies and practices, in addition to exploring the lived experience of individuals who are forced to live in the shadows. Collectively, we will highlight the social concerns associated with immigration policy and explore opportunities to challenge the punitive and often inhumane methods to address immigration in this country. I have here before you the format for today's presentation. We will begin with an examination of policies and practices in my Crim 208, Latinx, Latinos in the criminal justice system, which will be followed this afternoon by our course, Crim 305, Victimology, which will examine the lived experiences of individuals in regards to immigration. So I think that's all I wanted to say. Let me first introduce our first presenter, Dr. Arnold. We will post resources and bios of each of the presenters, so that will be available for you. So just briefly mention, just introduce yourself, but we are more interested in listening to your contribution and to your talk. So I defer the floor to you, Dr. Arnold.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to share the screen, which is not happening at all. Okay.
So let's see. Dr. Arnold, you're muted. Any reason why we wouldn't hear her?
Audio. She got it for a second. Should tell her to hold on.
Maybe you can try stop, because I think when you shared your screen, something happened, because we could hear you right before that.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I might have to do this without the slides, which is kind of a bummer. I'm sorry. Okay. So I'm going to start again. Sorry. Okay, so thank you very much for having me, and I will try to make this faster. So I was just saying, in 2019, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had argued that U.S. migration centers were camps. She was criticized for calling these centers camps because her critics argued that no camps existed outside of the Holocaust. In fact, many have argued that migrants are simply in jails or prisons. So in this talk, I will argue that a camp should not be defined in contrast to the Holocaust, but rather a prison. Based on my work on Hannah Arendt's analyses of statelessness in camps, I will define camps and provide some historical context to explain how the US took steps that make the emergence of a mass detention system from 1996 on possible. And so the picture, if you could see it, is of Ocasio-Cortez's tweet. And she was quoting Andrea Pitzer, whose One Long Night had just come out. So as Pitzer argues, concentration camps are not defined by death. Rather, they are considered by experts as the mass detention of civilians without trial. And then the next picture is one of Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt was one of the first authors to recognize the importance of the camp. As a German Jewish teenager, she was arrested by the Nazis once, and she fled to France without papers or money. She was interned 3 times by the French because she was Jewish. During her third period of detention, the Nazis invaded France, and there was a brief moment of chaos. She walked out of her camp with about 200 other people, and the rest of the camp was transferred to Auschwitz, and all were gassed. When Arendt wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism, she wanted to warn people that the camp itself is something modern, and it became a substitute for a non-existent homeland, when stateless people could not be deported. She explained how these camps were conceived of as the dialectical opposite of a prison. And so I'm going to ask you to idealize the prison, because I'm going to say a bunch of things that I think we know are kind of wrong, but in their ideal form. The purpose of a camp does not have to be death or even based on racism, but it notably holds people who are criminally innocent. In fact, she argued that refugee camps were also camps, just set up by friends rather than enemies. Both internment camps and refugee camps held people who lost their citizenship and their humanity. Or you could say they lost their civil rights and their inalienable rights. Camps hold people who are not acknowledged as persons before the law. This can occur through denationalization, which is the stripping of citizenship, or through designating arriving foreigners and/or foreigners encountering federal agents as non-persons. Camps often hold people for status crimes rather than moral violations. They are outlaws rather than criminals, in Arendt's words. When people call foreigners illegals, this term implies that their existence is the crime. The background to US migration policy is complex, but the plenary power doctrine was created in the Chinese exclusion cases of the late 1800s. These cases tested the constitutionality of Chinese exclusion policies in the migration context. I want to note that exclusion did not just stop or bar new arrivals at the border, but also significantly affected resident foreigners who had lived in the US for decades. The new issue was their race rather than any crime, and thus the laws were both Orientalist and eugenic. They aimed at stopping family reproduction of so-called Oriental people on US soil. In the Chinese exclusion cases, the following was decided. The federal government has sole and exclusive authority over all matters of immigration because immigration is a part of foreign relations. Therefore, it cannot be constitutionally scrutinized. Migration issues are considered political questions, which the Supreme Court holds they are not competent to adjudicate. Migrants in border zones who come into contact with federal agents, so back in the old days at ports like Angel Island and Ellis Island, therefore have no right to have rights, in Arendt's words. Residents who interact with federal agents could also be treated as non-persons. Migration is civil and not criminal, which compounds migrants' non-personhood at the federal level. Accordingly, there is no right to counsel, no charges, no sentence, or trial in the criminal sense. Detention was also deemed as not a liberty deprivation. Matters of immigration are civil, therefore, and cannot involve criminal sanctions. Detention and deportation are, again, not punishment. In arguing this, the line between matters of criminal law and the sphere of immigration law as civil was established. And this distinction is important today, even though we have something blurrier. The court held that detaining a foreigner, again, was not the same as criminal punishment, and therefore there was no deprivation of liberty, which means that they don't have to provide the same amount of reasoning or protections of the detainee. Arendt argued that a stateless person's plight is indicative of the collapse of the rights of man, which is like inalienable rights and citizenship, such that the stateless have no right to have rights. However, a small theft would ironically help this person, affording him or her criminal rights and making them a legally acknowledged person. So she argued that the same man who was in jail yesterday because of his mere presence in this world, who had no right whatsoever, and lived under threat of deportation, or who was dispatched without sentence and without trial to some kind of internment because he had tried to work and make a living, may become almost a full-fledged citizen because of a little theft. While suspected criminals were acknowledged by the law as citizens who were disenfranchised by the Nazis and forcibly removed to labor and death camps, were outside of the pale of the law. So again, this is ideal. A suspected criminal and prisoners have more rights, ideally, in the following ways. At least in the US context, they would have personhood per the 14th Amendment. They would have a right to a presumption of innocence, due process, and equal protection. The charges are clear. There's an examination of evidence. There's right to counsel. If there's a sentence, judges must provide justification and a length of time in prison. When the Nazis created laws, stripping Jews first of their positive freedoms, civil rights, and then their inalienable rights, which is negative rights, they did so on the basis of racial laws that made certain groups legally inferior. Arendt argued that this move meant that racism conquered the state. That is, racism, to the degree that it became it subordinated equal rights, undermined the egalitarian premises of liberal representative democracies. It violated consent and destroyed any notion of human rights. Just as a reminder, the US had implemented Jim Crow laws and racial apartheid during the same time period that Arendt was diagnosing. And we generally implemented Chinese exclusion laws, forms of Japanese exclusion, gender-based laws holding that all Asian women were immoral. We barred the mentally unfit, people who would now identify as queer, and much more, all under the guise of eugenic racism. I want to note that at least from the 1800s on, US migration policy had two components. One is policies regulating border arrivals, and the other is policies regulating foreign residents, people who live here. Arendt's work highlights not merely the killing of the juridical person, but also the importance of racist ideology in the system, both at the border, but also for residents. Racism characterized border entry with the national origins quotas, which were established in 1924 based on eugenic pseudoscience. And racism, again, should be understood intersectionally to encompass gender, poverty, queerness, mental and physical fitness, and more. In 1952, the national origins quotas were reaffirmed. And this is a bit shocking in the post-Holocaust era that we openly had eugenic criteria for entry. Since 1965, most migration policies have been facially neutral, but with racist impacts at the level of enforcement. Racial profiling and enforcement have been upheld by the Supreme Court. The famous quote on this is by Justice John Paul Stevens: "In the exercise of its broad power over naturalization and immigration, Congress regularly makes rules that would be unacceptable if applied to citizens." Targets at that time, when that decision was rendered, were different, but today, unsurprisingly, they are people of Muslim faith, Middle Eastern descent, and/or Central American alienage, who are most likely to be arrested, detained, and deported, with Central Americans filling the majority of beds in detention centers for most years since the system began. So laws might be worded neutrally, but an individual's alienage, their country of origin, most often determines how they will be treated. Mass detention and deportation are unconstitutional. For the past century, many legal permanent residents, undocumented immigrants, and would-be asylum seekers, and so on, have been non-persons at the federal level, but have had 14th Amendment protections at the state and local level. And that was until 1996. Nevertheless, I do want to point out that there were some exceptions. Even in this time period when you have a dual system that did protect people's rights, There was the Great Repatriation of Mexicans in 1936, Japanese internment, and Operation what, right? And so there have been time periods in which citizenship did not protect people from deportation. Nevertheless, detention was only sporadic and was not a mass system at the time. This is not to defend detention, but just to say it wasn't a mass system. In 1996, there was a devolution and things changed. The non-personhood at the federal level was now true in the area of anti-terror at the state and local level. This just means that people had fewer rights at the state level if there was an anti-terror enforcement going on. Detention centers have all the signs of a camp. So since 1996, we have authorized the system, and it really kicked in from at least 2003 to the present. So detention centers have all the signs of a camp, from non-personhood of those affected to no judicial review, no right to counsel, and the possibility of indefinite detention. Unlike prisons, ideally, detainees do not have the guarantee of due process rights, equal protection, or even habeas corpus rights. Detainees would be in a better position if they had the rights of criminals, you know, if the rights of criminals worked the way that we wanted them to. But it's also morally and democratically. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Bro, fuck this class. Fuck this class. Fuck this class. Fuck you, bro. Fuck this class. This class is for fucking niggas. Fuck this class.
Awesome.
This class is so ass. Fuck this class. Fuck this class. Fuck this class. Fuck this class.
Anyone want to
Fuck
see
this
my
class.
cock?
Fuck this class. Fuck this class.
My cum.
What's your name?
In jeder Stunde, an jedem Tag, nur zu denken an Deutschland, an Volk und an Reich, an unsere
If you guys did not know, they can send us to the police and you guys can get in trouble.
Show us your
Well,
kid.
it's so scary, dude. Yeah, we're so scared.
Why don't you just get the
Damn,
fuck
police, damn.
Fuck you,
Damn,
Katie.
police, damn.
Miss.
Show us your
Who
kitty.
gives a fuck about it?
What do we do? Jesus. Professor Perez, what do we do if we're being bombed?
I think immediately, I know that folks can step in, but if you're a co-host, if you can remove folks who are, that'll probably be the quickest way. But I think that if folks have the link already, they're going to continue to continue doing this. But that's the only sort of immediate thing. And then I think maybe Xavier, sorry, if you can give us more guidance, that would be great.
It's not letting me remove people. Sorry, I'm trying. Oh, and there's a Russian. Lovely. Okay, do you want me to?
I'd also suggest that if you're a co-host, not letting other folks in.
Yeah. Jesus. It's letting me stop these videos, but it's not letting me remove them. Do you guys want me to keep talking?
Amira, do you have a suggestion that would be helpful?
Please.
I apologize to the presenters. I apologize to everyone in the class. I apologize to everyone in attendance. We obviously opened this to the public, and it's made its way to some people who came here with the only purpose to disrupt an important conversation that I think that needs to be had. We have 3 or 4 people now that is in charge of controlling the event. So any instance in which they either speak inappropriately or make comments that are certainly not considered to be contributing to the conversation, then we will remove them right away. So I apologize. If we could please continue with the conversation. We would greatly appreciate that. But rest assured that we have 4 people who are monitoring the chat and the people who are entering, and then we will try to control our best for this. Thank you, Dr. Arnold.
Okay, did you want me to finish, or do you want to just go on to the next person, or?
I think what you're saying is incredibly important. And I think it's a great context for the students who are in attendance and who are listening to your argument and to your positions that they're introduced to this topic. So please, if you could just continue, and it was just a little speed bump along the way.
Okay. So what I've been trying to do is just kind of present Arendt's writings on camps and just argue that the key basis of comparison should be prisons and not the Holocaust per se, that detention has been based on detaining people on the basis of their status. In 1996, we know that personhood was devolved a bit, and we opened the door for mass detention and deportation, both at the border and also of foreign residents. The implications are that you could be locked up for a status violation, which is the equivalent of prison, but without criminal rights. Deportation is considered the equivalent of capital punishment to legal scholars. There's no examination of evidence. There's no right to counsel, no protection from cruel and unusual punishment. In this way, detainees are outlaws per Hannah Arendt. They're existential outlaws to the degree that they are criminalized for seeking work, renting an apartment, and conducting other life-sustaining activities. You have Haitians in boats, the Honduran caravan, and childhood arrivals who all arrive at this border in a very transparent way, and yet whose arrival is criminalized and treated as an enemy incursion. Something that Arendt wrote about, and then when they're jailed on the basis of their arrival, this is exactly what she had warned about. Nevertheless, I don't want to whitewash prisons. This comparison holds to a certain point, right? There's a sort of theoretical distinction between prisons and detention centers that, first of all, just isn't true except theoretically, and second of all, which collapses significantly in 1996. Since 9/11, we have mandatory detention for key groups. I've also lost my speaking notes, which is awesome. And Arendt wants to point out that the purpose of camps is to sow terror. Who will be next, right? In an arbitrary system, you don't know who's next. So people who are not detained, live in fear, and they avoid work, doctors, and school. Camps inculcate the belief that detainees must be guilty. They must have done something. The camp becomes material proof of their culpability. Camps provide a geospatial site where abandonment can occur. Hypothetically, torture, solitary confinement, which has also been used on minors regularly, forced cell extractions, including pepper spray and dogs, family separation, particularly under Trump, and forced sterilization, quite unfortunately happening in the past 2 years. And my point is that all of these actions on detainees are not crimes per se, because the subject has been conceived of as a non-person. Camps legally suspend the law. Detention centers are camps, right? The juridical person has been killed. Detention centers hold people who are civilians and non-criminals. There is no sentence, no right to counsel, and so on. But they are also prisons, including being housed in the same sections. Like prisoners, detainees face being detained in remote areas far away from community. The increasing use of private security firms in both sites often leads to human rights abuses. And there are a number of human rights abuses which occur at almost every level of treatment. Without the plenary power doctrine, detention centers would not exist and would not allow the systematic human rights abuses. From children to the elderly, to the well, to the very sick, foreigners caught up in the system are non-persons. This entails violations of the best interest of the child standard, freedom of expression, freedom from arbitrary detention, freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, and violations of the rights of the refugee. But the main violation is the system itself, right? Detention, arbitrarily jailing people on status crimes is a human rights violation. As Walter Benjamin predicted, the tradition of the oppressed, right, he says, teaches us that the state of exception in which we live is the rule. And the argument is that the practices on foreigners will be used on prisoners. And that is the case. It's a whole other talk. But prisoners' rights have diminished in several ways since the 1980s. And I would argue that there's a convergence. If anything, prisoners' status within prisons and in the criminal justice system is approaching that of foreigners. At the end of my talk, if the slides had worked, I just said, if you want to do something about this and you're an undergrad, you could join DePaul Sanctuary through DHEAD. Thank you.
So thank you again, Dr. Arnold, and I apologize for the rude interruption, and again, apologize for the class, and thank you for continuing with your presentation. Moving forward, I'd like to introduce Felicia Arriaga. She is a professor at Appalachian State University, and so then I allowed her to lead her discussion regarding sites of crimmigration enforcement. Thank you, Dr. Arriaga.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm going to drop into the chat the presentation if you would like to follow along or view it later. If my internet or anything happens, Megan, are you saying you can't hear me or you can hear me? Oh, we can. Good. Okay, great. So hopefully everyone, if you'd like to follow along the presentation, thank you all for holding this space for us. Obviously, it's an important topic if this is where we're at. I'm going to briefly talk about two sites of crimmigration enforcement. And thank you for everyone on this panel. I'm really excited to have a discussion as we go along. So I'm going to specifically talk about jails and schools, although I'm sure that the next panelist, who is also on my dissertation committee, will talk a lot more about one of these places too. And so I just also wanted to point out here that on the right-hand side of this presentation is a group called Comunidad Colectiva, who put together these great sort of protests in North Carolina. And so a lot of the conversation that I'll be talking about is specific to North Carolina context. But as you'll see, some of this will extend to different places. And at the end, I'll sort of talk about opportunities for resistance as we sort of think about this. So I know that Katie talked a little bit about the history, and I've just highlighted a few different pieces that I typically like to focus on when thinking about sort of the history and sort of the overlap, or at least the extension of sort of immigration and the criminal legal system. So in the 1980s, we do see at least some of the sort of information that Katie was talking about, which is the expansion of immigrant detention across the country. I also highlighted here that in 1990, we see that INS, which is formerly, or the former version of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, we start to see that those individuals start to carry firearms and start to look a little bit more like what we think about sort of local law enforcement in that essence. And then in 1996, as Katie mentioned before, we start to see sort of this expansion of different programs, especially in the interior of the United States. If someone can also help with the muting of the drawing, that's, I don't know if I can actually do that. Let's see. Oh.
I don't know if I can. I don't see that person. I think it's the one that says LAPD.
And I think we can't actually sort of take that off. So let's see. I'll just keep going and hopefully they can get to all of the slides. So we'll keep going. So the other thing that when I share the slide, okay. Okay, so I'll just keep going and thank you for security folks who are trying to help with. Hi, can I try sharing again? Can you all hear me? Yes, okay, so can I share my slides or no? I think if we cut off the ability for others to annotate, I think it should be okay. Okay, so as far as the sort of thinking about immigrant detention, I also just wanted to highlight too that immigrant detention is not experienced the same by certain individuals. And there's this sort of report that came out a few years ago from the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, which specifically talked a bit more about the impacts for Black immigrants who often are having to pay higher bonds as well as are at greater risk of deportation. And so that's some of the context and national context. I also focus a lot of my sort of thinking about this as what do we actually see across the country? So what are the sort of different ways that we see immigration enforcement? And unfortunately, this varies widely by locality. This is a great map from Immigrant Law Resource Center that talks a bit more and goes into more specifics about the sort of different partnerships that can sort of happen between local law enforcement agencies, as well as sort of state and federal agencies. And so I encourage folks to go check this out if you sort of have questions about your locality and exactly sort of how they're sort of operating when it comes to these things, because I think often we have this conversation about local immigration enforcement as whether a locality operates with it or without it. And I think that that is often a little bit more simplistic than the way that we should be talking about these partnerships. Specifically for North Carolina, the way that I at least like try to help people understand what this means is that often we sort of have sort of national policies and national agencies. And then as we continue to sort of go down through sort of different governing bodies, we have sort of state agencies and state legislatures that may dictate different policies, say like driver's license policies, which hopefully folks recognize that sometimes when individuals are driving and they may have sort of an expired license or maybe aren't able to obtain a license because of state laws, that this may sort of actually mean that they're more at risk of being arrested, especially if they're immigrants, and then being taken to a jail where they might be sort of identified as being an immigrant, and then processes may start for them to go into deportation proceedings. And at the other sort of level of this, as we continue to go down locally, we can think about sort of city councils, county commissioners, and county sheriffs as sort of having roles in different ways that may also sort of open up or stop different kinds of immigration policies. I particularly sort of think more about sort of the county sheriff and the relationship with county commissioners because of this close relationship and the county sheriff's ability in particular to opt in to different kinds of partnerships with immigration and customs enforcement. And I also just remind folks that this particular sort of third level down, the city council, the county commissioners, and the county sheriff are all elected for the most part across the country, right? So these are also positions that we should think about on a regular basis as we sort of think about electoral politics as well. And so again, to come back to sort of the main point of thinking about these sites, there's also sort of different ways to think about, well, where can actually immigration enforcement come into play in a person's life? And so I've categorized these in this way, although there's different ways to categorize them just to sort of be a little bit more clear about them. And so when I'm thinking about sort of pre-encounters or instances when individuals may sort of experience the criminal legal system, there's sort of a beginning process for that. And so the two sort of places that I'm going to talk a little bit more about today is in the jails and in schools as well. Although there's obviously some of these pieces. And although I categorize these, one of the things that I also want to sort of emphasize for folks is that in the way that ICE talks about this, there's actually a bunch of different sort of what they call touch points, meaning that ways that the individuals, especially immigrants who are going through the criminal legal system, may actually move out of the criminal system and actually be more accessible, or at least like for ICE, be more accessible to actually be arrested and detained in the sort of immigration system. And I know that this is very complicated. This is why I sort of sent over the presentation, because I do think it's worth sort of looking at a little bit more in depth on your own to really think about. There's so many different touch points as we think about sort of the criminal legal system, where immigrants may actually experience this other sort of system, as Katie pointed out before. But I also want to highlight a bit more this sort of lower part of this chart, which, sorry, I had pulled it out. Let me actually just skip these slides and I'll come back. But this lower part of the chart, where we see that, at least in the gray here, juvenile offenders are sort of not necessarily, there's not necessarily these circles around where juvenile offenders fit into that. And so I'll come back to that in just a minute when I talk about sort of how my youth experience this, right? And so often I'm thinking about sort of where are quote unquote opportunities for ICE to actually be sort of encountering individuals. So whenever we're talking about jails, more specifically, the program that I look at a little bit more intensely in North Carolina is what's called the 27G program, which is a particular type of local immigration enforcement partnership, mostly with sheriff offices across the country. And I'm not going to go too in depth into these, except to say that there's a sort of a longer history in North Carolina of different sort of county sheriffs wanting to actually adopt this program. And so this first map is back from 2009, where we do see that there are some counties across the state, and North Carolina has 100 counties, and so 100 different sheriffs who can either opt in or opt out of these processes and these sort of partnerships. And so as we sort of go along, I sort of skipped to 2020 in some of my research to start to actually think about where are the opportunities for resistance when it comes to putting pressure on the adoption in these particular partnerships. And so here I'm also highlighting that we have sheriff races in North Carolina every sort of 4 years. And so here, at least in sheriffs for 2020, or sorry, this should be sheriffs for 2018, that we see that sort of like the places in green are places where the sheriff who got elected actually ran on a campaign to stop immigration enforcement partnerships in their local jails, whereas some of these other counties who had the program did not necessarily take that stance. And so again, there's sort of opportunities for community resistance in these areas. Unfortunately, I think in response to this and what we've seen across the country, particularly in places like Florida, we've seen that actually that has prompted more sheriffs to engage in this newer form of the program, which is called the Warrant Service Officer Program. And in North Carolina, at least in the red here, these are the counties sheriffs that have adopted that particular program as a response to not being able to have this first sort of iteration of the program, but also while state legislation is pending regarding what level of enforcement local sheriffs can actually engage in as well. So I'm going to come back to this. So thinking about sort of schools as sites of enforcement too, or at least possibilities for enforcement. So again, here, at least in the way that ICE has sort of framed this for this particular program, there isn't necessarily sort of a clear pathway for how juvenile offenders may experience the criminal legal system and then potentially move into immigration enforcement. proceedings. But I think this at least pairs nicely with our understanding of the school to prison pipeline, right? And so this is clearly something that we know is of interest to a lot of our students, to a lot of us, whenever we're sort of having this conversation when it comes to the criminal legal system. And so whenever we're thinking about sort of youth and how they experience the criminal legal system, this is sort of a starting point for us to think about. And so this is just a little bit of information from one of the organizations in North Carolina called the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, who has a youth justice project. And so I bring that up to specifically talk about at least the sort of move in North Carolina in 2015 and 2016 to actually think a bit more about sort of the school to deportation pipeline and how to sort of make interventions there. And so this is I have a chapter in this new book that's coming out this spring called Race Frames and Education. And specifically, I'm looking at sort of these initiatives to not only put sort of limits on school boards and schools to limit sort of ICE coming to campuses, but also thinking more broadly about what kind of sort of legal consciousness sort of rights information do youth actually need on a regular basis, right? So not just immigrants, but on a regular basis, how do we sort of limit the use of police in sort of schools as we sort of think about them as places that have school resource officers, have sort of police presence. And so in 2015 and 2016, there was a few cases in North Carolina in particular, this group called the NC6, who were a few of them were picked up, and one of them was picked up on the way to school, like trying to go to his bus stop. And so this sort of pushed a lot of educators in the Durham, Raleigh area, which is sort of the centrally located in North Carolina, to push back on the ability for ICE to do this, particularly because in 2011, there were specific information from the Department of Homeland Security Secretary, which outlined what are called sensitive locations. So these at least are supposed to be locations where ICE presence should not be occurring. And so I've included just a list here. And so in North Carolina, this sort of sparked this, let's actually take a look at what is going on within our school system and how are we actually protecting immigrants and by extension, other individuals who may come in contact with law enforcement. So on the left here, is a sort of policy that was adopted by Durham Public Schools, specifically to not only limit ICE warrants, but also to sort of put a limit on all types of warrants that are being sort of sought from students. And so I think for at least the local organizers, this was an opportunity for them to actually sort of think a bit more about what type of sort of education is being provided and what type of support is being provided to young people and their families if they are experiencing the criminal legal system. On the right-hand side is another sort of case study from Raleigh that is also pushing for this other type of presence from, or at least trying to propose an alternative to law enforcement agents or SROs in schools. And so this Peace Builder program is a program that local organizations are pushing for as a way to not only try to stop sort of any possible sort of ICE intervention, but also to stop any type of law enforcement intervention in the school system as well. And so I'm happy to sort of take questions about that and trying to move forward. And so I just leave with a few things and sort of recommendations for you all as you're sort of listening and thinking about these sort of sites of enforcement, is I often sort of ask my students to use these two databases, which is called the Track Immigration Database and the sort of map that I showed you before, and pick a location, right? So pick your own location and think about sort of, and click on there, see what sort of partnerships they have, and then try to figure out what is actually happening with that. Unfortunately, I found that most of this is not necessarily covered by local media. And so really, I think, consider why that might be the case. I think probably most of us know why, but just to sort of make it sort of real clear for yourselves that this is not something that is getting much attention at in many locations. And then I think take some time to sort of reflect on what you found. And then I know I have about 1 minute left or less than that, but you can also think about sort of asking local law enforcement what their procedures are, particularly when it comes to someone who is driving without a license. In North Carolina, at least, we know that people were being arrested and taken to jail and then being put into deportation proceedings because they weren't driving without a license, or they were driving without a license, and the actual law enforcement agency did not have a protocol specific to that particular instance. You can also just ask what type of collaboration there is. I will say that unfortunately, sometimes this isn't the most truthful answer, but this is where we have sort of public records requests, have lawyers, reporters digging into us to be able to better help us understand how our criminal legal system can be more transparent and accountable when it comes to these policies. And I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions. And again, please feel free to reach out, but hopefully you all can also review the PowerPoint and reach out at any time. Thank you.
Hi all, so I am up. So give me 1 second and I will share my PowerPoint. Okay, apparently I will not share my PowerPoint because my Zoom is not letting me. I think it hasn't been updated because I am on a computer that's not mine. Great, so the hits keep coming. So apologies, you're just gonna see my face, which is a total bummer for me.
Do you want to send it to one of us and we can share, Amanda?
No, it's okay, it'll take me too long. So I will just chat with you all. And so my name is Amada Armenta. I am an associate professor at UCLA. I'm interested in immigration enforcement because I grew up on the border. And there's a lot of immigration enforcement there. It's been a lifelong obsession since then. So thanks for the invitation to this panel. I've obviously thought a lot about crimmigration, and I just want to pick up where Dr. Arriaga left off. And what I'd like to, I think the main argument that I have to make is that local law enforcement agencies are almost always participating in immigration enforcement just by doing their everyday jobs. As Dr. Arriaga said, things like arresting people for driving without a license, a local law enforcement agency officers will often think that that's totally fine and that's not immigration enforcement. And technically they're right because they're arresting people for violations of state laws. But state laws often criminalize immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants. So a lot of the ways that people get picked up are through the sort of touch points that Dr. Arriaga mentioned. So I just want to summarize 3 types of local participation in immigration enforcement to sort of get a picture of the different ways that law enforcement agencies that are not national agencies participate in immigration enforcement. And then I also want to just make the point that when we think about law enforcement agencies, we often focus on the police for good reason, right? These are the people, representatives of government with whom we have the most contact as just everyday people who live in cities. But the number of agencies that can sort of contribute to the deportation machinery are much more vast than that. So we heard a mention of county sheriff's departments. Many counties have sheriffs that are locally elected. Their departments have arrest officials, and the history of sheriff's departments is very different than the history of municipal police departments. They tend to police more rural areas, larger geographic areas, and since they're locally elected, the people to whom sheriff's deputies are sort of beholden to are maybe different than the people that a municipal police department would be responsive to. In addition to these 2 agencies, we've got all of these other agencies in states with arrest authority. Every state has some sort of highway patrol or some sort of state patrol. All of these agencies can also arrest people for violations of state laws and put them through the deportation pipeline, but they might not be as susceptible to local pressure or local sanctuary policies as municipal departments. So when it comes to the ways that different law enforcement agencies, state and local law enforcement agencies can sort of participate in crimmigration, they can do so directly. So this is when those agencies actually enforce immigration law. And they can do that through programs like 287G, where they formally cooperate with ICE to get permission to do immigration enforcement, or they can do so just because, like that's what's happening in Texas right now. The governor has directed state and local law enforcement agencies to arrest people on suspected illegality. It's illegal, but many times the consequences that people don't escape the consequences, even though these types of arrests are illegal, they happen, and the punishments for them happening are not at all severe. So it's very hard to stop an individual officer from these sorts of pretextual arrests and their consequences if that individual officer decides to make these kinds of arrests, even though it is indeed illegal. In addition to direct enforcement of immigration laws, local law enforcement agencies can cooperate with immigration enforcement agencies informally by honoring immigration detainers through secure communities, by letting ICE into their jails or prisons to look at who or interview or screen people. There's a lot of ways, or letting them know when people will get released. And then, of course, as I mentioned previously, there's just the sorts of everyday policing that law enforcement officials will do because their job is to police people and indeed arrest people. And undocumented immigrants and other immigrant communities often become more arrestable because of the ways that they're outside the law by design. And because of this, we get these headlines about crazy cases in which people get deported after arrest for incredibly minor violations of law. Things like getting deported after being arrested for selling food on the street. In Tennessee, there was a case of someone who was deported after fishing without a license. There are tens of thousands of cases of people who are deported after things like driving without a license. But basically, when federal immigration enforcement reaches down into the spaces that local law enforcement agencies and jails operate, it turns these very minor violations into possibly deportable offenses, even though people are actually getting deported for being out of status and not for the sort of misdemeanor or criminal violation for which they're arrested. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to share with you some data that I collected a very long time ago and I published in a book 5 years ago. So very old data, I apologize, still think it's kind of interesting. So this was a project that I did in Nashville, Tennessee, which was a place that had a local law immigration enforcement program called 287G. And I thought I'd just share some data about the ways that local law enforcement agencies and their officers at various levels think about participating in immigration enforcement. So what's important to know about Nashville, Tennessee at the time that I did this research are a few things. So number one, the police department did not have immigration enforcement authority, but the police department is doing all the arrests. The sheriff's office has had immigration enforcement authority at that time. And what that meant is that they were screening everyone who was brought into the jail for possible immigration violations, but they were not patrolling or arresting anyone. And so this becomes more important when I tell you about the ways that they think about their own participation in immigration enforcement. So what was happening in Nashville at that time was that the police chief was very invested in a particular style of policing where they wanted their officers to make as many traffic stops as possible. This had a particular name at the time. I don't remember it right now, but really it was about the use of pretextual police stops to try to find additional violations. So because this was a department priority, individual officers felt a lot of pressure to pull people over. They were getting the message from their department superiors that their job was to make many stops. There was not a quota, but officers were subtly and not so subtly encouraged to make stops at meetings. And this also determined whether they were seen as productive. And obviously their productivity had implications for things like their promotions, whether they got a good patrol car, whether they got days off on the days they wanted or on the shifts that they wanted. So some of the things that patrol officers said based on this pressure to produce is the following, which an officer told me as I was riding around in his car with him. He said, "To the lieutenants, there's no such thing as too many stops. The stats make them look good because they can say, look at all the work my guys are doing. I try to get in my stops when I'm on my way to stuff, but you have to be careful. You don't want to be that guy who left your buddy hanging on a call because you want to pad your stats and then something goes wrong." So this kind of quote was really common, which was officers felt pressure to make stops, but sort of acknowledged that they had other things to do, that making stops wasn't always convenient, etc. Now, obviously, at the community level, with officers making so many stops, people felt like people in some neighborhoods, especially in the Latino immigrant neighborhood where I did my observations, really felt that they were under intense surveillance. They complained at community meetings that people were getting stopped all the time. So one thing that a precinct commander sort of announced at a community meeting that was for Latino business owners is to try to explain the logic of this style of policing to them. He said, "We want you to know that these enforcement efforts aren't based on crime data. We do location-based policing, not people-based policing. We hope with all these vehicle stops, they'll rob somewhere else. With these traffic stops, we're serving warrants left and right. We don't just turn our officers loose and tell them to make a difference where they think they can." Now, what ended up happening in Nashville was because police officers were making so many traffic stops and undocumented immigrants were ineligible for driver's licenses because of state law, officers inevitably pulled over unlicensed drivers. And when they did, they sometimes, not always, but sometimes arrested them. And they felt like arresting people for driving without a license was particularly legitimate because people also didn't have valid state issued ID that police would recognize as establishing that person's identity. And when police don't recognize someone's identification number, that person's lack of verifiable identity becomes to some law enforcement agencies and officers dangerous. And when they think someone is dangerous, they think it's okay to arrest them. So this is sort of what happens when the police chief explains to me why it's okay for officers to arrest people who are driving without a license. So the police chief says, "Now here's the problem that the officers unfairly get criticized about. If you're riding in a car without a valid driver's license, without insurance, without registration, what part of that is the officer going to ignore? None of it. Let's get you into the system and get you properly identified. Then you can bail yourself out." So the interesting thing here is that the chief acts like anyone who's arrested can bail themselves out. And while that should be legally true for undocumented immigrants who are identified for removal at the local jail, paying bail doesn't get them anything. It just transfers them over to federal custody where they're more likely to get deported because, as I mentioned, at that jail, they were doing a 287G program where everyone who was arrested was screened for their possible removability. Now, because the police department was not actually doing any immigration screenings themselves, they were just arresting people for violations of state laws. The police department said over and over that they did not participate in immigration enforcement and that all the fault lied with the sheriff who was involved in this program. And of course, what deputies said was who were actually doing the screening to put people into immigration proceedings, what they would say is something like this. So here's an interview with a deputized immigration enforcement officer who said, "We have nothing to do with them getting arrested. We get called heartless, we're cold, we're breaking up families, but they don't understand. We don't go out and get these folks. They get dropped off to us. So all my job is, once they get brought in here, is I just have to find out their legal status. So all of this that we go out and we're breaking up families and we're arresting people for, I mean, we have nothing to do with that. That's not our job." Here's another interview response from a deputy that's very similar to this. This person says, "Well, of course, my powers are the power to question someone for their admissibility or inadmissibility for removal, and beyond that, my powers are none. I get all these guys who tell me, you can let me go, you can let me go. And I say, you don't understand. I'm not the man." So I share this kind of data with you just to make the point that even local law enforcement officials who are very clearly participating in immigration enforcement and removal do not see themselves as part of the immigration enforcement system. That local law enforcement agencies very much contribute to immigration enforcement because of the way they do their job every day, and that it's really challenging for local law enforcement agencies to avoid contributing to immigrant criminalization and removals, because unauthorized immigrants in particular are often in violation of a lot of state laws that make them arrestable. And because the federal government uses previous arrests and these jails and prisons to identify people for removal. Obviously, sanctuary policies and other kinds of policies and institutions go a long way in protecting people. But if these policies are not in place, local law enforcement officials individually can sort of do what they want to try to catch people into the deportation pipeline. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
All right, hello, my name is Joseph Cordova. Everyone can hear me, is that out? We're good? Okay. Very excited to be here. I'm the next speaker. Again, Joseph Cordova, I'm an attorney with Florida Legal Services. I am also a very, very proud DePaul alum, class of 2001, majored in political science and history, and I'm very, very, very excited to be here today. So what I have planned to say today, kind of listening to the previous speakers, I want to make sure that I don't repeat too much because they've already said some wonderful and amazing things. They've said it better than I was planning on saying it. So if you hear something repeated, make a note that it's probably because it's something that's important, okay? Rather than roll your eyes and say, we already heard this, make a note and say there's a reason why we're hearing it again. Okay, and then rather than trying to repeat, I'm hoping that what I say complements everything that's already been said. So what I want to talk about is how the overlap between immigration law and criminal law kind of comes together and consequences a lot of families. So many immigrants in the US live in what are often referred to as mixed status families. This means that a father or mother may be undocumented, children are US citizens, maybe an older brother is on DACA, maybe an uncle or a cousin in the same household is a lawful permanent resident, they have a green card. But each individual in the family who has a status and a story unique to themselves, even so, the entire household is going to live and make decisions as if they are undocumented. Why do they do this? Because as you've already heard, the fear of bringing the sheriff's department, the local police, or even ICE into the home and into their lives could eventually lead to the deportation of anyone in the home without proper status. And so, what does it mean to live as if everyone in your household is undocumented? It means we're probably not going to call 911 when we have emergencies. It probably means that we're not going to sign our US citizen children up for extracurricular activities where the events take place in outdoor and public spaces, unless we have a friendly neighbor who can give them rides, because we may not have a driver's license or we don't want to be seen outside. We might skip mandatory court dates for ourselves and family members because going to a court with bailiffs and sheriffs, we don't want to be there. And we're definitely not going to be exercising our rights and protections under certain civil rights acts related to equal employment and fair housing. But what I talk about, these fears are unfounded, are they exaggerated, or are they just misplaced? Are they based on misunderstanding or living in the shadows? Is that really the only path available? My personal answer is probably it's extremely rational, but maybe there's some wiggle room with some better understanding on how to exercise a life that where you can live a little bit more freely. So I want to talk a little bit about jurisdiction. And again, I don't want to repeat too much of what's already been said, but under Title VIII of the US Code, only the federal government can pass and enforce laws that concern matters of immigration. That's extremely important to understand because a lot of states have tried, and sometimes they dress up a law to make it look like something else, and they try to sneak it through. But eventually those laws meet their fate in federal court as overstepping the powers relegated to the federal government. So violations of immigration law are supposed to be handled and enforced by the federal government. But as we just got done learning about the 287Gs and partnerships with ICE, it's not always that simple, okay? I want to kind of skip to this idea of what does it mean to have a local law enforcement official enforcing immigration law? And I'm going to bring up a little scenario to kind of put it in your minds of why that really shouldn't be the case and why it's arguably unconstitutional, okay? So, all right, we have a lot of college students listening today, so I'm gonna pretend this might apply to you. Hopefully it doesn't. Let's say you get arrested for underage drinking, okay, by the local sheriff. Do they call the FBI to tell them about it? Well, they're really not supposed to, although being in custody often means seeing if any other warrants are up for your arrest. So let me give you a better example. If you ever get arrested for, let's say, public urination, does the police officer then call the IRS to see if you're up to date on your taxes? No. And that's because one is a local enforcement officer and the other is a federal administrative agency, okay? That's similar to a local sheriff department calling ICE to say, hey, we picked up this gentleman on driving without a license. Do you want us to hold him in our county jail for 48 hours while you decide whether or not you want to come get him? This is referred to as an ICE hold. This is what we're talking about with the 287Gs, the BOAs, and everything like that. It is unconstitutional. It's a violation of habeas corpus. A county jail cannot hold somebody and they cannot limit their liberty without cause, okay, without due process, without reasonable cause, probable cause to believe that a crime was violated. So if your normal practice is, we caught so-and-so driving without a license, we usually just give them a ticket and a notice of hearing on the spot. But if your name's Juan Ramirez, we actually take you in, and that's going to be a different experience for you. That could be racial profiling. Now, as said earlier, maybe they took you in because you didn't have a valid license and you also didn't have ID. So now it becomes a safety issue. That is absolutely true. Sheriff's departments, police officers, they're always able to say, I have reasonable cause and reasonable suspicion to make a decision or an arresting decision based on a safety consideration. But if Juan Ramirez shows his matricula or his Mexican consular ID, which is a government issued ID in lieu of a driver's license, well, he's not absent identification. He's just absent a driver's license. So if your normal practice is to give someone in that situation a notice of hearing, but again, for people who show consular IDs or a Guatemalan ID or a Slovenian ID, doesn't matter what country it's coming from, if those folks get pulled in and then they get an ICE hold, that is not, it's not proper practices. That's basically picking and choosing the people you get to give tickets to and the people you get to send to county jail and call ICE for. And again, it's going to be based on national origin discrimination. So you got to kind of keep that in the back of your head. Why am I being arrested for this one particular crime that is enforceable under my state or my local ordinances? And then while I'm being arrested, they called another administrative agency under a completely separate government, under a completely different program. So that's one of the reasons why you want to think the overlap of criminal law and immigration law. Should there be the overlap? And if there should be, how much of an overlap should there be? So I'm going to talk to you a little bit now about immigration law and what it means to actually violate immigration law. And hopefully you'll have a better understanding of being able to say, you know what, immigration law is this totally other thing. Why are my local state laws interacting? So if you violate immigration law, and I'll throw out the first one for you, the most commonly confused violation of immigration law is crossing the border illegally. The proper legal term is improper entry or entry without inspection, often referred to as EWI, E-W-I. So when someone crosses the border at a non-designated place of entry without proper inspection and admission, this is a violation of immigration law. It is not a violation of state criminal laws. However, under section 1324C of Title 8, it gets a little confusing because, as mentioned earlier, that particular section of the law, of the federal immigration law, recognizes, it has this line in there that says that anyone whose duty it is to enforce criminal laws does in fact have the right to enforce this particular federal immigration law. However, if you are a local sheriff and you're going to arrest somebody for being in the US without permission, you have to have reasonable cause or a lower scrutiny probable cause, okay? Well, if you didn't see them cross the border without permission, what's giving you the cause? Okay, there are some case law and some court opinions that have recognized that the simple failure to provide legal documentation is not enough to prove probable cause. Now remember, I said there are some court decisions that have said that. So it's kind of up in the air as far as what gives a local officer probable cause to believe you violated immigration law. Not to mention, there are certain violations of immigration law that are recognized as a federal misdemeanor. If you're a local enforcement officer, you cannot arrest somebody for a misdemeanor without actually being in the presence of the law being violated. So the sheriff's department, can they arrest someone for being in the US without permission? Maybe in some circumstances, with a warrant, with reasonable suspicion, probable cause. Maybe you saw it, but if you're in North Dakota, I don't know how you saw them cross the border without permission. Okay, so there are going to be some circumstances where it's a little gray, and then there's going to be some circumstances where it's not so gray, but there's still some overlap that shouldn't be happening. Remember, a lot of times if you're going to make that arrest, you want to put in the back of your head, are you arresting me or even asking me about my immigration status? Is this racial profiling? Is this some sort of entrapment? So if you're an immigrant in the US and you don't have proper documentation, you're not supposed to be approached and asked for it either, because that's not the local officer's jurisdiction. That's not their position, okay? Now, if you do violate this particular crossing of the border without permission, there are criminal penalties under federal law. It can result in a short prison sentence in federal prison. It could also result in a large fine around $1,000. There's a civil penalty around $50 to $250. But as far as the actual consequence of crossing the border without permission, the one that's going to be the most impactful in immigrant families' lives is that you're now considered inadmissible to the United States. So when it comes time for you to actually petition and apply for a lawful permanent residency here in the US, often referred to as having a green card, it's going to be denied because you are inadmissible to the US for violating an immigration law. The law you violated, you probably violated two. One was you entered without permission, and the second is that you stayed in the US without permission longer than 6 months or longer than a year. So 21 years later, your US citizen born child is now 21 and they can petition for you. But as far as the US is concerned, you're not here. You were never properly admitted to the US. You're still in your home country. So when you fill out the paperwork, you're going to have to go through what's called consular processing. You have to do your interview and all that stuff back at the embassy or the US consular office in your home country. And once you leave the US to go do your immigration paperwork and interview, you're not going to be allowed back in for at least 10 years, possibly more, depending on the other violations of immigration law they found. So the impact of crossing the border without permission and staying without permission, you're always looking over your shoulder for law enforcement to possibly arrest you, detain you, call ICE, kind of also closing the door to future petitions. So how does this all come together in the lives of immigrant families? Now, I told you mixed status families. Even if 5 of you are US citizens and 1 of you is undocumented, all 6 of you are going to live the life as if you are all undocumented because you don't want to risk anything for that 1 member of your family. Well, what else does that mean? Okay, it means that you're probably not exercising a whole lot of the rights that are available to you. So I'm just going to talk about 3 particular instances and then I'll end it, okay? The first thing I want to mention is that US citizen children are always eligible for benefits that they're eligible for. So during the final year of the Trump administration, they tried to change what is referred to as the public charge rule. This is an immigration rule that gives immigration officials more reason to deny an application for permanent residency based on previous and potential receipt of government benefits. But here's the catch. If you're eligible for the benefits in the first place, you're probably already a permanent resident or US citizen. Not to mention your kids receiving what is rightly theirs has no bearing on your immigration application. Yet out of fear and lack of proper information, over 200,000 families in 2019, 2020 voluntarily quit their benefits, thinking they would be punished for receiving them. Punished in the form of, I'm not going to be able to apply for citizenship one day or for permanent residency one day. And to top it all off, the rule that was passed was overruled a couple months later. So bad information misunderstanding led to unfortunate choices. So the more we live in this confusion of the overlap of state laws, criminal law, immigration law, what applies, what's my consequence, we're going to be making decisions that often impact us more negatively than it should have. The second thing I want to point out is that emergencies need to be responded to. If you're the victim of domestic violence, you need to get help. But there are too many stories of one partner calling 911, the police arrive, they arrest the abuser, which leads to jail, which leads to calling ICE, which might lead to deportation. Now, the abused partner simply wanted to end the abuse. They didn't want the father of their children to be deported. So a lot of times families will put up with the abuse because they're too concerned about calling 911. And then the third thing I want to mention, extremely important, is that undocumented individuals have rights. And this has already been mentioned today on this panel. If your employer is mistreating you or exploiting you, you have the right to equal opportunity employment, even if you are working without authorization. Those who work without work permits or proper authorization still need to be treated justly, and the law protects them. Similarly, landlords and housing providers cannot threaten deportation, sexually harass, or discriminate against applicants and tenants based on where they are from. While immigration status is not a federally protected class under the Fair Housing Act, national origin is. So harassment, coercion, or retaliation are never allowed in housing. This is an area I work in most these days. And I get a lot of calls from immigrant families about the poor treatment they receive from landlords, but few follow through with wanting to file official complaints. This is a very don't rock the boat attitude in immigrant communities because they fear that the system is designed to hurt them no matter what. So there's a huge, huge catch-22 in the immigrant communities. They don't exercise their rights because they fear it will lead to consequences. But by not exercising their rights, they are forced to endure further abuse and exploitation. And so because these families fear the worst case scenario, they choose not to exercise their rights, leaving the entire family, even the US citizen members, living in the shadows and victims of the entire criminal immigration systems. So I'm going to end it there.
Thank you to everyone who presented, and thank you for the audience for your patience, and thank you to the presenters for your patience. I'm going to open up the floor very briefly for a couple of questions. So again, I have my class in attendance. I welcome any questions that you all might have to any of the presenters or to the presenters at large. So please feel free to ask some questions. Yes.
I have a question for the second speaker, Alicia, I think. So basically, Dr. Arnold mentioned about where you have detention centers kind of acting as prisons, right? And how all this is clearly falling into immigration. And my question is, when it comes to working with children at detention centers, how does the U.S. not signing the protection of the rights of the child influence how, like, the rights that young people do have in those detention centers?
I'm actually going to pass that to maybe Joseph, because I actually don't do much of anything in detention centers. So Katie or Joseph may be able to jump in. I mostly do like interior, so like in jails, which detention centers are sort of governed in a different way. So I'll pass that to maybe Katie. I think Katie, you had your hand raised, or Joseph?
Joseph can go first and then I can.
No, Katie, go ahead. Go ahead, Katie, please.
I mean, the standard of the best interest of the child is clearly violated in U.S. detention centers. And that's been stated over and over by UN observers, by legal groups like NIJC in Chicago. So absolutely violated just by detaining non-criminals for mere arrival. Joseph, go ahead.
Yeah, the only thing I would jump in for regarding detention centers, and I don't know if this is exactly helping your question, but remember earlier, I think it was either Felicia or Amada who mentioned that technically detention centers aren't punishment. Immigration law doesn't recognize them as punishment. They recognize them as correcting the immigration status. So while we're doing the paperwork, we put you in these places. So to claim you're violating someone's rights because you're unlawfully punishing them, they get to turn around and say, we're not punishing them. We're just waiting until their paperwork goes through.
But it's still it's still a violation of the
It's still a violation, absolutely.
Yes, it's supposed to supersede all other considerations. But yes.
Yes. Thank you for that question. Any other questions that you all have? Yes.
So as you said, like arrests start with local law enforcement. How does it applies to the role of the federal government? Is that like what you said, which was illegal for them to hold them and then call the federal agencies? But can you explain more about the role of federal agents, the agencies?
I'm happy to jump in real quick on this one. So a 287G or a BOA, here's how it works, and I'll go quickly. The local enforcement officer, they pick somebody up for whatever misdemeanor crime they decided, they put them in the local cell. Normally you post bail or they do the paperwork, and within 24 hours, you're released. They call ICE during that 24 hours and they say, are you looking for this person? And if ICE says, yes, we are, please hold them. They have an agreement where ICE pays the local enforcement county jail as a subcontractor. They pay them $50 a day, $25 a day to say, let us use your jail as our impromptu federal detention center. So for 48 hours, you're going to detain them for us. We're going to give you $50 on Monday for being a detention center for the weekend, and we'll come by and get them. That's how they try to skirt the constitutional violation of habeas corpus.
Other questions? Does anyone have any other questions? I had a question. It had me thinking about, like, in recent events, we've seen, particularly following the protest of 2020, you see almost this backlash in American society. It's almost like this polarizing effect. You would think that that tremendous moment sort of motivated or maybe inspired the country to become more liberal towards issues and open towards issues of racial injustice in American society, and we almost see the complete opposite. Are you all experiencing a similar type of or witnessing a similar type of backlash as maybe when I think about Dr. Arriaga's discussion about some gains that were achieved in certain settings and maybe seen the backlash. So I was wondering if you all have witnessed or maybe observed a backlash against immigrant sort of movement and as of recent dates.
Yeah, I can jump in first, since I started talking about it. Yeah, so I think there has been some sort of backlash, particularly, I think there's this term that political scientists like to use a lot, and folks who do more sort of GOTV type of work and voting rights work around, called preemption, which means that that when, well, typically the reason that that gets prompted is because there's a locality that takes like a step around limiting immigration enforcement, and then the state legislature comes in and says, actually, you can't do that, right? And so we've seen that across, particularly the Southeast. At least in North Carolina, we saw state legislation coming in that would force sheriffs to cooperate with ICE to a greater extent than they already do. That particular legislation was actually from Texas. So Texas, and we know this because the representatives who actually introduced this went on like the Capitol Tonight, which is our like state level sort of news, and said, well, ICE approached me and said, we want you to copy the Texas bill. And so there's like pretty clear, like in explicit sort of ways that this is happening across the country, where we're seeing at least this type of pushback, where we think of like, and I don't like to use the term sanctuary because it's just it depends on what the sort of state legislature defines sanctuary as. And so I don't like to use that term, but we do see this not just around sort of different types of immigration partnerships at the local level and trying to at least like limit their partnerships, but we also see this in different ways, particularly I think in North Carolina, it was interesting to see this happening at the same time. The same representatives who introduced this proposal to force sheriffs to cooperate with ICE also introduced a proposal to take money away from localities that try to defund the police. And so we're seeing at least like this sort of intersection of any type of quote unquote progressive criminal justice or immigration policy changes that we're starting to see this like pushback on those types of progressive sort of moves. And I say progressive with like quotes because I don't know how progressive there are, particularly because there are reforms that we know actually just keep on getting us to a place where we're not actually getting any type of transparency and accountability often. So I will also say too that if you're thinking about it from like an abolitionist perspective, that's not exactly maybe the route that people want to be taking, which is like these incremental types of reforms to be getting somewhere that who knows where we're actually going to be going, because we're just going to have to try to get ourselves out of the next reform and the next reform. So I think that those are the examples that I've at least have here in North Carolina, but is particularly, I think, relevant right now in the Southeast.
And then lastly, what advice would you give to undergraduate students moving forward and who want to get involved in these issues and possibly do something at the local level, if not the federal level?
I'll jump in. So when I introduced myself, I think I mentioned that for the most part, I practice what's referred to as community lawyering, which means I go into the community and just kind of drop myself in and say, what's going on? What can we do? What do we need to tackle? Now, when you do it in an immigration community, more often than not, you become an immigration lawyer. And that's fine, because that's the major issue that's facing a lot of families. But what you also start to learn is what are the local issues that they're facing? And it might be different in this county than the next county over. So my advice as far as first steps go are just drop yourself in the community, do a little outreach, and just get to know the families and what they're facing. Don't come in with the attitude that says, I'm here to save you. Come in with the attitude that says, I'm here to listen to you, and then I'll see what I can do to help.
DePaul Sanctuary is working on these issues. We're just starting out. We have an undergrad group, and we have just filed for nonprofit status. If anyone's interested, they could email me.
Well, I think that is the end of our time. Again, I apologize for the interruption. I'm glad we were able at least to get the most important points out. We are going to take a short break, and we're going to continue at 1:30 again for anyone who is in attendance and wishes to remain. And the same goes to everyone in the virtual world. Please feel free to stretch your legs, and then we'll come back in 10 minutes at 1:30. Thank you, everyone.
All right, guys, thank you very much. Those of you that are my students, thank you for being here. Dr. Vecchio, thank you for the victimology class playing host in part to this event. We're all very excited. I am going to pass around the sign-in sheet. So if you're one of my students, please sign that in just as a nice little fail-safe for me. But I'm going to turn things back over to Dr. Perez, who is going to introduce our 4 panelists today, and we'll have a lively discussion. Thanks again for being here, guys.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for participating in this event, a national discussion around crimmigration. We have 4 panelists on the virtual presentation, and want to thank them and thank everyone who is in attendance again virtually. We are going to speak in this second panel. We're going to discuss about the lived experience of immigrants, and certainly look at it from the perspective of immigrants as sort of victims, which is something that we are not traditionally trained to consider them as. And so I think this is one way for us to challenge some of those assumptions that we have associated with immigrants and criminality. So I will allow the presenters to take center stage. Let me first introduce Carlos Cuevas. Carlos Cuevas is a professor and director of Violence and Justice Research Laboratory at the School of Criminology with Northeastern University. So please, if you all will give your kind attention to Dr. Cuevas.
Good afternoon, everyone. I assume everybody can hear me. And first, I want to thank you all for the invitation, getting a chance to talk about this. I know that the bios are going to sort of be available for everyone to review, but I think one of the things I want to sort of provide in terms of context is I'm a clinical psychologist. I actually have done a lot of work with survivors of violence, particularly within the Latino community. And some of the research I talk about, I sort of have that perspective in terms of my way of thinking about it, my approach to it. So I'm going to go ahead and share. So I am hopeful that everybody can see the presentation. So one of the things I wanted to talk about today is essentially sort of some of the key themes that have come about from the research that myself and my colleagues have done over the last like 15 years now, which makes me feel really old. And so just as background, there's sort of a number of projects that were funded by the National Institute of Justice that looked at different forms of violence among the Latino community. We looked at sexual violence, dating violence among youth, and we looked at hate crime and bias victimization. And one of the things that I think is really important is that there are certain themes that came about from this work that told us a lot about the victimization experience within this community and told us a lot about the things that matter regarding how this is not an issue of just immigrants, but issues within a community that is incredibly diverse and very often isn't seen as a diverse sort of, group of individuals. And the reason, the motivation behind this is in part because it's a community that has had immense growth. There has been a massive growth of the Latino community over the past decade, about a 25% growth. They make up about 18% of the US population. And one of the things to keep in mind is that while immigration was the key driver of that increase in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, in the 2000s and in the sort of the current day, we went from sort of immigrating to this country to basically making babies in this country. And so we sort of now have the population really being driven by, people being born here, so that the diversity in terms of who are immigrants and who are not has really sort of shifted over the years. The other reason for why I sort of focused on this has to do with the fact that the research on violence and the research of victimization within the Latino community, within the immigrant community, has not kept pace with the growth and diversity of that community. 2% of the research, just a simple literature search, about 2% of the research that's focused on victim issues has the Latino community as sort of a central aspect of that research. That's a problem for a number of reasons, but for the main one being is we don't know as much about this growing population in this area of violence research than we do about violence research in general. There's a lot of reasons for that, and the research nerds in the group can probably appreciate this, but a lot of it has to do with recruitment and trust in that community and participating in research. And remembering that when you do these sort of big national surveys, you're probably missing a big part of the picture. The other problem has been that this research has tended to focus on sexual violence and dating violence. If you look at what we know about the experience of victimization in the Latino community, is that this is where a lot of it sort of started, this is where a lot of it has been. And over the years, we realized that it's really important to understand the full scope of victimization experiences. And that isn't just in this line of research, that isn't just within the Latino community, but has been a movement in the violence and victimization scholarship for a while now. And so we really miss out a lot when we don't take the sort of comprehensive approach to this. The other sort of issue that's been a challenge in the research world is that if you do big surveys or just general surveys, you're missing a lot of the things that matter, that make the community diverse, that are going to play a role in terms of victimization and in terms of the consequences. And so if you think about what are some of these cultural factors that we miss if we don't target certain groups for the purposes of understanding what's going on in those communities, you're going to miss things that matter. A lot of our research says whether you're an immigrant or not matter, acculturation, social support, all these other things are going to matter. And I'm going to touch on a few of those before I get to some of the more recent stuff, which I think is really important. I think probably sort of much more kind of central to the conversation today. So if you think about understanding the full scope of victimization, one of the things that we know from this research is that if you've got one form of victimization, chances are you have got multiple forms of victimization. One of the things we know is that the cumulative effect in that community is going to really be the driver of negative outcomes, whether it be mental health, whether it be other negative sort of health outcomes, things like that. However, one of the things that we're discovering is that there are certain things that tend to matter more than others. One of them being the experience of hate crime and bias victimization, which I'll sort of leave for sort of the closing part of my talk, which is when you even account for all the other victimization experiences, it holds up in terms of having a unique negative outcome. And I think it's important to keep in mind, in part because it is a type of victimization experience that isn't just happening to the person, but that it is happening to the community. When we then start to bring in the cultural factors and sort of things that are salient to this community, you think about issues of immigration, acculturation, and all those things. If we just look at, is somebody an immigrant or not, does that make a difference? Very often it does. It tends to sort of be associated in some ways, actually being an immigrant, with better health outcomes. We sort of talked about a lot of people sort of know about the immigrant paradox and this notion that being an immigrant is associated with sort of positive outcomes. There's two things to keep in mind, and there's sort of some of these interesting things that show up in our research. One is that if you account for the degree of acculturation, that immigrant effect starts to go away. In other words, as you become more integrated and knowledgeable of the sort of host culture that you're coming into, the benefit, if you will, of being an immigrant starts to go away. Second is the idea that that's not a static thing. It's not that you are or are not acculturated. It is a process and it is fluid. And so a lot of what I think we sort of still are yet to understand is that the impact of being an immigrant and the impact of how you then choose to or able to or do or don't acclimate to the culture that you're coming into is going to have a role in terms of mental health outcomes, in terms of other sort of social and health sort of metrics. And the acculturation effect kind of tends to wash out the effect of being an immigrant. Now, one of the limitations is that a lot of this has been with sort of general population surveys, and some of our work was with sort of bigger sort of national samples, which I think when I talk about the hate crime work we've done is going to miss some of those subgroups within the community that are probably the ones more at risk, that are probably the ones who are more in sort of experiencing some of these things, and are essentially sort of who we're missing in this conversation, where some of these things may not play out the way they more generally play out with that community. The other things to keep in mind are things like the impact of gender role, the impact of some of other sort of what has been sort of stereotypically thought of sort of traditional expectations around the culture, sort of expectations around the community, especially given that a lot of what we see, and we particularly saw this with research where we looked at sort of the impact for Latino women, which was that as you move away from traditional expectations around gender roles, around the culture, that starts to become a risk factor in terms of the possibility of victimization, and very often also a risk factor in terms of some sort of negative mental health, psychosocial outcomes. There's an interesting thing that I think is happening when you sort of take a bigger sort of step back and take a bigger picture of this, which is that you have great diversity within the community in terms of who is more at risk of being victimized, where are the pockets in the community that are potentially sort of targeted, and you are doing that with a community that is not static in these dimensions. There's a lot of movement around becoming more acculturated, being more or less integrated into the culture, holding on to sort of more your cultural origin practices and beliefs. And so I think the challenge in understanding what the research tells us is recognizing the sort of the aggregate community level diversity with the individual level changes that a lot of these folks are going through. And so some of these things we see as I talk about sort of acculturation as a risk factor, family support being a big protective factor. A lot of those things aren't going to be static. They're going to be sort of moving targets in a lot of ways. So one of the things that we sort of took from all this work, primarily focused on interpersonal family violence, was really to sort of shift over and talk about the thing that really came to the forefront probably in the last 5 years, which was this issue of hate crime and bias victimization, and also particularly around some of the border issues and some of the immigration issues that the previous presenters talked about, which I loved hearing that, because I recognize my talk is a very hard shift from that, but I think those presentations do a great job of helping people understand the environment that all these things are happening in. And so one of the things we started seeing is, okay, we're seeing more hate crime. We're seeing increases across many different communities. The Latino community wasn't sort of unique in this. And really recognizing it as a different form of victimization. And in some ways, part of the sort of, I don't know the term, the criminalization of immigration, but certainly a consequence of being perceived as an immigrant. It doesn't matter if you're an immigrant or not. Somebody who commits a hate crime doesn't ask you if you've got a green card or a citizenship before they call you a racial slur. So what are we seeing? Well, the first thing is how much more this happened over the last, well, more than the last 5 years. This is sort of the pocket of time that I present here. Overall, hate crime went up. We know that, and it's what happened. Hate crime went up by about 31% over the time period that I show on this graph. It went up 62% for the Latino community. In other words, it was double the rate of increase than the general overall increase in hate crime. There were certain communities, Latino community, anti-Semitism, the Asian American community, who were disproportionately driving the increase in hate crime because they became, in many ways, those who were targeted. The other problem we have is when we talk about hate crime statistics, we're often talking about sort of the official counts. That usually means the FBI counts, the UCR, the Uniform Crime Reports, or the NCVS, which is National Crime Victimization Survey, which is a self-reported survey, national survey. They give us a snapshot. They give us a sense of how much things are changing. What we did is we said, okay, we're missing a lot of what's happening if we don't, A, ask the community themselves to tell us how much they experience hate crime or bias victimizations that aren't necessarily hate crime. And we think these are the more vulnerable people that get missed when we sort of do these big national surveys. So we actually did a community-based survey across different parts of the US and actually did a survey on victimization and hate crime experiences and bias victimization. And the thing that struck me, and we got pushback when we published this, but I sort of stick by this number because I want people to understand how much of the picture we're missing is. If you look at the reported hate crimes and you look at hate crimes that were reported by the folks we interviewed in the community, essentially the hate crime rate should be about 9,500 times higher than what you're seeing in the UCR. And I literally put an extra bullet there to make sure nobody thinks I stuck a typo in there. You're looking at the tip of the iceberg, and it is a huge iceberg that's floating underneath. It's 73 times, if you look at something comparable like a self-report survey, it's 73 times that. The degree to, and this is, by the way, just hate crime. I'm not even talking about how much of the bias victimization is experienced that is not sort of qualify as a hate crime. And one of the things that is striking is that we look at this and think, wow, that's a lot of people, that's a real undercount. But what is missed is that these are offenses that really impact the community, not just the individuals. And the way I sort of give this example is sort of coming from a personal perspective, which is we change our behaviors because of what we're seeing. I'm an immigrant. I am also a US citizen. And I am, relatively logical, reasonable person. When I went to Arizona for work, I put my passport card in my wallet. That was in 2019. I haven't taken it out since. So I, a US citizen, walk around with my passport card just because I think I need to. And so it starts to tell us about how the community is impacted by this. And so if we take, and I take a little bit of a snapshot, and I talk about issues on I call it issues on the border. It's not really issues on the border. It's issues of coming into this country and experiencing the potential trauma of being here in a way that isn't sort of, the way you're supposed to come in. And I think about, well, what's that experience going to be for folks at the border, for folks who are being held? And I think one of the things that gets missed is that a lot of times people talk about the trauma of entry, and they talk about the trauma of a family migrating across the border and the difficulties that come with that path, which as a clinician, I've worked with clients who've sort of gone through that. And, there's no question about the trauma that can be experienced in that process. But I think what we miss is that we don't look at the long lens when it comes to this. People look at this, okay, this happened to trauma, it's bad, and don't think, oh, well, what comes after that? Well, a lot. First of all, there's this idea of how this impacts the community as a whole. And so one of them has to do with things like, there was a report that was done by the folks over at Urban Institute that looked at these families, these individuals, not doing routine things because of immigration fears. They don't go to the grocery store, they don't go shopping, things like that. The long-term consequences, you're going to be seeing kids, adults, families who are experiencing mental health, physical health consequences. re-victimization risk, which we actually know from this research project that we tackled, delinquency, substance abuse, trafficking risk, all these other things that come after you cross the border that aren't the things that necessarily are sort of thought of as the key trauma. And then the issue that this is not an immigrant issue, it's a community issue as a whole. Everybody, people who are citizens who are here documented would tell us, yep, I don't go to the grocery store and only one of us works now just because we don't want to face the possible immigration risk. But they're here on a green card. The community is really impacted. And we also miss the fact that there's going to be even subgroups within that community that are going to be impacted more. We are seeing a lot of issues that then when you take into account being an immigrant, being of a different race, LGBTQ plus community, that sort of starts to say, well, there isn't just one thing that's going to be an issue here. I don't want to spend too much on this because I think some of the folks in the earlier part sort of talked a lot about this, but I think there's a couple of things that's really important to think as we go forward in terms of what are some of the research we need to do. The couple of things that I think I like to highlight is one is that prevention needs to be not only a service for victims, but a service for perpetrators. We can't prevent victimization violence if we don't sort of also work with the people who are perpetrators, potential perpetrators, to prevent them from sort of engaging in that behavior in the first place. The other is, I can't tell you how every project we've done, how important some of these community-based agencies that we collaborate with are to this work. They are essentially your gateway. People don't go for help. Every project we've done where we looked at help use and service utilization, a third of them go report to police or do something. That 2/3, 3/4 are talking to their families and their friends. The gateway is these community agencies because there's trust in the community agencies, and they can sort of help the handshake in terms of working with the criminal justice system to sort of remedy these experiences. We were talking before about sort of the risk for domestic violence partners and their sort of immigration risk in doing this. One of the things that was left out, I think, is that the way of helping remedy that is to go to these community agencies and say, okay, you have the trust of the community, help us find a way for them to get the resources they need, because they don't want to do it, they don't trust it, they think it's a risk. And then the obvious one is about immigration policy and rhetoric. And I think it's incredibly important that for the folks who work on the policy side, who work on that side of this equation, that has a significant impact on how these communities function, how these individuals function, and the kind of experiences that they're having to deal with. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cuevas. Next, I would like to introduce Julio Montanez, who is a graduate student from the University of Central Florida.
Hello, everyone. My name is Julio Montanez. I'm a graduate student in the University of Central Florida's Sociology Department. My faculty mentors for this particular project are Drs. Amy Donnelly and Dr. Amy Rechtenwald. My project is on the federal and state level policy connections regarding intimate partner violence against immigrants and refugees. To start, we have to know a little bit more about intimate partner violence. So it's physical, sexual violence, stalking, and psychological aggression by a current or former intimate partner, including spouses, dating partners, cohabitants. According to the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey of 2015, 80 million people experience contact sexual violence, physical violence, and or stalking across the lifespan. In addition to having various types of violence, such as sexual violence and physical violence, intimate partner violence has other dimensions, such as frequency, how often it occurs, duration, how long it occurs, severity, how much violence occurs, and perpetrator quantity, which can mark the experience of multiple perpetrators across the lifespan. Intimate partner violence in general is a gendered phenomenon. Women are more likely than men to experience sexual violence, more severe physical abuse. And according to the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, the intersection of physical violence and stalking occurs at a higher rate among women than men. And women are more likely to be killed than men in the context of intimate relationships. Some other information, intimate partner violence tactics such as isolation and intimidation, can reflect those tactics used in systems of group domination, such as racism. And moving on to the immigration part of this equation, in 2020, there were over 40 million foreign-born persons in the United States, according to the Pew Research Center. By 2065, it is expected that this number will exceed 78 million, so almost 80 million persons who are born outside of the United States. Contextualizing these populations are immigration-related issues such as raids, family separation, detention, removal, and a broader crimmigration system. According to the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey of 2010, 24% of foreign-born women experience contact sexual violence, physical violence, and or stalking in their lifetimes. This is compared to 17% of foreign-born men who experienced contact sexual violence, physical violence, and or stalking by intimate partners. A one-day census by the National Network to End Domestic Violence shows that on just one day in 2014, 19% of DV programs in the United States provided advocacy related to immigration. Subsequent repetitions of this one-day evaluation show that between 18 and 22% of DV programs in the US provide advocacy related to immigration in just one day during the year. And in this context, there are a number of federal policies such as the U visa and T visa, which provide protections to certain populations. So the current study, the goal was to understand the intricacies of state-level statutes targeting intimate partner violence against immigrants and refugees. This project started in 2018, and we started with a feasibility search to see if this project was even feasible. So, for example, we looked at a quick Google search of domestic violence statutes, immigration, and we found a couple of statutes across the United States that at the state level. So we decided to conduct a larger search, which concluded in June of 2020. From then on, two researchers myself included, coded the statutes independently. The statute, the two resulting databases from the coding were compared, and 100% agreement was reached among the coders after discussion on discrepancies. So the search criteria for these statutes, we put all 50 states and DC under inquiry, all statute types ranging from health, public benefits, and all effective dates. We used a Nexus Unisearch, the advanced search function, to look for statutes and legislation, specifically statute codes. And these are the various search terms that we used to look at, to try and excavate these statutes across the 50 states and DC. So, for example, in the Nexus Unisearch, abuse and alien would be put in the same search to look for all statutes that we can capture with those particular search terms. There were 90 searches total, and afterward, the results showed that we were able to find 72 statutes across the United States, across 17 states. Most of these statutes were in the western part of the United States, followed by the Northeast, then the Midwest, and then the South. We sorted these into various topics, such as budgets, health, law enforcement, public benefits. For example, Section 402.87 of the Florida statutes states that the Florida Department of Children and Families shall develop a structure for providing survivors services, such as ensuring access to benefits. Under budgets, another example would be California Code 1463.27, which levies a fee atop of any other fees levied against domestic violence perpetrators, which would be used to fund DV programs focused on helping immigrants, refugees, and persons in rural areas. Two of the statutes were not able to fit cleanly into these topic categories, so they were put in their own category of other. 8 of the statutes mentioned human trafficking or trafficking in persons. In addition to being domestic violence related, they would also human trafficking related. For example, an Illinois statute that laid forth eligibility requirements for SNAP for human trafficking survivors. And in addition to the topics and dimensions of human trafficking, there were also a number of federal protection component language in the state level statutes, such as the U visa, which was the most found federal protection component within the state level statutes, followed by the T visa, asylum and refugee status, followed by the battered spouse or child waiver, another category where, once again, not everything fit too cleanly in the other categories, and self-petition and cancellation of removal. And moving from that section of the work, I did want to make everyone aware that there are other research entities doing state level work across the United States to look at state to state differences in domestic violence immigration statutes, such as the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. They have a guide to state laws on U visa and T visa certification, and the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project, which has a very extensive detailing of state by state public benefits information. With that, these are the references that were detailed within the presentation. And I thank you all for your time and have a great day.
Thank you again, Julio. Our next presenter is Mercedes Valadez, and she is a professor with the Division of Criminal Justice at California State University in Sacramento.
Hello, and thank you. I hope everyone can see my screen. Today I'm going to be presenting on a research paper that was recently published. I will be presenting a specific section about it that addresses campus environment and assessing the academic engagement of undocumented college students. And my name is Mercedes Valadez. I teach in the Department of Criminal Justice, as was earlier stated. So I will begin with a bit of background before getting into the actual paper. So this paper was part of a larger study in collaboration with the UC and CSU faculty from various campuses. It was a collective research project that was in part of the effort of the UC Collaborative to promote immigrant and student equity and the Undocumented Student Equity Project. The goal was to generate research that would help us better inform policies and practices and create a more inclusive environment for undocumented college students. The reason, sorry, I see that there are people trying to join. I'm not sure if I should be the one clicking admit or if anyone can admit them. So I'll continue. Over the past couple of decades, California has seen a substantial change in terms of the support provided to undocumented students. We've seen that the support extends to financial aid and in-state tuition in some cases. The public university system that we looked at was the UC and CSU, California State University and the University of California. Some statistics about that. 1 in 5 students, 1 in 5 undocumented students are part of these two systems. And so I think it's important to understand what undocumented students experience on campus. We know that undocumented students contend with unique challenges. They face substantial educational barriers and experience structural marginalization with respect to financial aid, in-state tuition, among other things. We know that they can experience negative campus climates where they may feel ostracized, discriminated against, they may experience bias and may even be attacked. We know that these can lead to negative consequences in terms of having students feel like they have a sense of belonging on their campus. But despite these setbacks, we know that undocumented students demonstrate resiliency and actively seek out support and resources to support their educational goals. With respect to academic engagement, this paper looked at both positive and negative forms of academic engagement. With respect to positive academic engagement, those behaviors we looked at were studying with peers, communicating with their instructor. Negative behaviors included skipping class or going to class unprepared. And the focus of this presentation and the paper are that we explored the relationship between campus environment and academic engagement among undocumented college students in four-year public universities in California. We know that research finds that positive forms of academic engagement are positively associated with student motivation, critical thinking, increased GPA, and retention, whereas students who are less academically engaged have greater odds of declining skills, lower GPA, and leaving college prematurely. With respect to campus environment, negative campus environment can create negative experiences for students, especially if there is an anti-immigrant campus climate. At the individual level, there may be faculty, staff, and peers who commit microaggressions, who make it clear that the students don't belong in the classroom, who use derogatory and negative language or dehumanizing terms when referring to undocumented immigrants. We know that campuses that are undocu-friendly are campuses that undocumented students specifically select because of that reputation. And so prior research with respect to positive campus climate finds that it's crucial to their success to create an environment where students, undocumented students, can thrive, whether that's providing them with resources or support by faculty, peers, and the campus. Sometimes campuses will release statements, especially around specific significant court cases. So again, this study explored how campus climate towards undocumented immigrants is associated with these two forms of academic engagement. With respect to the outcomes, we expected that more positive campus attitudes towards immigrants would result in higher positive academic engagement and lower negative academic engagement. It would result in more positive engagement, whereas more negative campus attitudes would result in higher rates of negative academic engagement. In terms of the methods that we used, we collected survey data from 9 UC campuses and 23 CSU campuses. This data was collected between March and June of 2020. On average, most participants were 21 years of age, 48% were from the CSU system. The majority self-identified as Latinx, and most of the participants were self-identified as female. The dependent variables we looked at were academic engagement, positive and negative, and we controlled for age, race, ethnicity, university type, campus climate variables, and we use hierarchical regression in our analyses. With respect to our findings, we found that positive campus attitudes towards immigrants were associated with an increased score in positive academic engagement, whereas perception of negative attitudes were associated with higher levels of negative academic engagement. Our findings correlated with prior research, which finds that creating a more inclusive campus environment is associated with positive learning outcomes, and that exclusionary campus environments can decrease engagement in campus life. Our findings also indicate that inclusionary and exclusionary climates play unique roles in how they shape students' academic engagement. So with respect to our findings, we see that fostering a sense of inclusion is not enough. It's not sufficient. We also need to root out exclusionary climates in order to create a more inclusive environment. We argue that to root out exclusionary climates, campuses and departments should investigate the use of anti-immigrant terminology and sentiment, which may be embedded in some disciplines and the curriculum, including the use of dehumanizing terms to describe undocumented individuals. With respect to the limitations of this study, one of them is generalizability. We can't say that these findings may apply to students in other states, especially in states where we know that there is more anti-immigrant sentiment. California is more focused on creating an inclusive environment for undocumented students than say somewhere like Georgia or Mississippi. So it would be interesting in the future to look at how students in those regions fare in terms of these outcomes. It would also be helpful to expand the participant pool. As I noted earlier, the majority of the students who participated in this study self-identified as Latinx, but it would also be helpful to look at other immigrant community groups to see how they would fare in terms of these outcomes. And so despite these limitations, the findings from this study carry several practical implications focused on promoting practices that will enrich undocumented students' college experience. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And then our fourth speaker for this panel is Pedro Rios. He is the director of U.S.-Mexico Border Program with the American Friends Services Committee.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for the opportunity to present on this work. Essentially, what I'm going to be speaking today is about how Customs and Border Protection, which is a parent agency of the Border Patrol, uses collective punishment to create an anti-immigrant narrative that further criminalizes migrants and justifies state violence as a response, as an acceptable response to migrants who are seeking safety in the US. And so I'll share some images as we're going through and as I'm describing some of what I'll be talking about. I've been working in this field for over 25 years on immigration and border issues. I grew up along the US-Mexico border in the San Diego-Tijuana region. And so I've been able to see the changing landscape of militarization and how it's impacted not only the migrants who are arriving in the area, but also border communities in general. So I want to start off by creating some context. So we know from the first session, we heard one of the speakers talk about how, or mentioned that Border Patrol was created in 1924. And I think what's important is to provide some context into that. So the Border Patrol was created as a result of an attempt to stop migrants who were coming in to work in the fields and in other industries, but quickly thereafter became a force to stop primarily Mexican labor, Mexican migrants. The initial Border Patrol agents were coming from the lines of white supremacists and vigilante groups. So it was quite common to see, for instance, Texas Rangers or former Texas Rangers who became agents as part of the first recruits, as well as people that took the law into their own hands and acted on that aggression. And it's inspiring to see, unfortunately, a very sad topic, but it's inspiring to see that there's much more academic work in terms of highlighting and documenting how that state violence and that non-state violence by non-state actors were involved in lynching of Mexicans during the Mexican Revolution and other periods of time where they provide a little bit more context into the formation of the Border Patrol as a formal entity that assumed that responsibility with the legacy of violence that we continue to see today. And so, and the focus on the Border Patrol is my point precisely because it's some of the work on documentation that I've been involved in. But along with the Border Patrol, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security in 2003, with the parent agency, CBP, Customs and Border Protection, their field agents are part of the OFO, Office of Field Operations. And so if you're crossing from Mexico into the US through a port of entry, it's those agents, the OFO agents, who are asking you for documentation. So it's important to make a distinction between Border Patrol, who are the agents dressed in green, whose primary function is to have surveillance of the border in between ports, and then also the OFO agents whose primary responsibility is at the ports. But both of these make up the larger CBP, or Customs and Border Protection. And again, founded on white supremacy, founded on this idea of determining who belongs and who doesn't based on principles of white supremacy that we continue to see replicated over the course of time. And so I want to highlight just a concept, which is collective punishment. And the Geneva Convention says that is when people are punished for acts that they did not commit. Collective punishment of a group of persons for a crime committed by an individual is also forbidden, whether in case of prisoners of war or of any other individuals. In other words, you can't punish entire populations for the perceived actions of a few. And so we've seen this take place over and over, and how then goes into the theme of crimmigration in the field. So for instance, with the arrival of the larger caravans have been arriving to the ports for many years, but this one in 2018 was one of the larger ones. CBP, Customs and Border Protection, instituted something called metering, a metering system, where they essentially said that they didn't have enough room to take people in when people were showing up at the ports and attempting to make a claim for asylum. This had the effect then of many migrants and asylum seekers were having to wait in Mexico, in Tijuana here and other border, Mexican border towns, waiting for their turn. And then we're subject then to other possible actions against them by people who are waiting to prey on them, by abusive practices by Mexican municipal police and federal agents as well. And then as well as being subject to living out in the elements. And we've seen that through the many migrant encampments that have developed over the course of the past number of years. And so the other practices that CBP instituted has been purposely slowing down the crossing lanes. And I'll share how this has an effect of influencing narrative on non-migrants. So for instance, if you have 15 lanes that are typically open for border crossing, and if CBP closes half of them down and suddenly has 7 lanes, people that are expecting to cross will have to wait for a significant greater amount of time as they're trying to make their way from a Mexican border town to a US border town. And so what happens then is that people that are regular border crossers start placing blame on someone else. And the blame then usually gets placed on the migrants who might be suddenly appearing in Mexican border towns who are waiting for their turn to be processed or to turn themselves in. So I'm talking pre-pandemic. There's also what we saw, especially during the Trump years, but we've also seen this during the Biden years, is CBP engaging in what are known as enforcement exercises. Let me see if I can get this to work. Some of these enforcement exercises essentially amount to several hundred CBP agents and exclusively Border Patrol agents, and in some cases, some of the military officers that were supplementing and reinforcing the militarization during that period of time. And so they engage in these exercises that might last between 20 minutes to 45 minutes, and they will shoot flashbang grenades, they will fire mock smoke bombs, and we'll do this exercise and stop the crossing through the port of people who are waiting to cross from, in this case, from Tijuana to San Isidro. And here in this image, you'll see the concertina wire that had been recently placed over on the left side, and the smoke from one of these mock smoke bombs that was launched. This image is of an image at night at the Otay Mesa border crossing, where hundreds of agents came out at night again to practice this exercise. And so the narrative then that I mentioned earlier, the narrative that CBP will use is to suggest that these exercises are necessary in order to prevent or prepare for the possible mass incursion of migrants who are amassing along the border towns waiting to come into the US. That really has been a fictitious argument. We really haven't seen a large number of migrants, with the exception of one time where CBP agents fired tear gas canisters and used the helicopter to push the smoke and then the tear gas into the canal where migrants were amassing, and where Mexican municipal authorities had actually pushed migrants into that canal, and they were sort of blocked in. On the north side, it was the US authority. On the south side, it was Mexican police that had blocked in the migrants, and they had nowhere to run in that case. This image here is of Border Patrol agents in the Friendship Park area, which is the southwesternmost corner of the US. This is one of the Air and Marine CBP helicopters that was flying during the event that I mentioned. And so some of the other tactics that we've seen that CBP will use also to shape narrative to make it so that the general consensus around population is to blame migrants, and henceforth then to justify the use of violence as a way to respond to people who are seeking safety and leaving their hometowns for different sorts of reasons, is minor inconveniences that they will have. So not only shutting down some of the lanes and slowing them down, but also then asking border crossers for their documentation. So if you're in a vehicle and even before you reach the inspection booth, there are CBP agents that are stationed about 100 feet into the lanes, where they're asking people to show them their passports before they even arrive into the inspection booth. And so this is also an inconvenience, but also a way to make it so that those who are blamed for these inconveniences are migrants. And especially because migrants don't have, in this case, the power to be able to express their sentiments about why they would want to be there. And in some cases, when there has been a group of migrants that have gone to the ports, to the San Isidro Port of Entry, for instance, especially after the announcement of certain changes to legislation or to policies, then you might have some of the people who sell products, some of the merchants there, who will then become aggressive against the migrants and start throwing rocks at them. And so it becomes a very contentious issue. Along with this, so what I'll say before that is some of the more exclusionary practices that we saw implemented during the Trump years were the use of the Title 42 order, which uses the pandemic as a pretext to give Border Patrol powers to remove people without due process rights. And so if someone is crossing into the US apprehended by Border Patrol, the Border Patrol can expel that individual without presenting any court processing. So this has the effect of increasing the recidivism of migrants who are attempting to cross 2, 3, or 4 times. And you've had cases where migrants who have been returned a number of times have attempted to cross into the US, and then they die because they've crossed through very dangerous deserts that are extremely remote, or they've crossed through the ocean, through the Pacific Ocean, where maritime crossings have increased substantially, and you've seen the number of deaths occur as a result of that. The other one is the processing of the migrant protection protocols, or otherwise known as MPP, or Return to Mexico program, which forces migrants who are presenting an asylum case, forces them to have to wait in Mexico for an undetermined amount of time. Now that US and Mexico have agreed, there's an agreed amount of time that they can wait in Mexico, but some of the agreements that Mexico requested have actually not come to light. For instance, providing shelters in Mexico with resources so that they can actually shelter people, providing an opportunity for migrants who are seeking asylum to access attorneys or to have legal support. That has not really occurred to the extent that where someone feels confident that they're knowledgeable about what the processing is. Our staff had people at the court hearings, at the MPP court hearings, and what we typically noted is that migrants who were going there were really ill-informed, not informed at all about what the court processing was. So immigration law is complex. For someone who is leaving their country or their hometown, to expect them to completely understand the processing is just out of the question. So both Title 42 and the MPP have had the practice of targeting Black and brown migrants. And so it's not surprising that these really were developed out of some of the much more extremist elements of the Trump regime, but that the Biden administration has accepted, has implemented, and is using the same rationale to continue to force people into them and continue to place people in harm's way. What I also want to briefly talk about is that it's not only the impact or the targeting of migrants, but we've also seen advocates as well as journalists who have been targeted and their work criminalized as a result of supporting migrants or even just covering the issue of immigration. Border Patrol, for instance, CBP generally had a list of people who, once they attempted to enter into the US, both advocates and members of the press, were singled out, targeted, had experienced some excruciating detention while under CBP custody. And so we see then that CBP was engaging in this practice of targeting people who are working in this field. And all of this qualified under the backdrop of what has been decades of a strategy that Border Patrol put in place, starting in San Diego, known as a prevention through deterrence strategy. And this was a strategy that essentially had in mind of territorial denial, where you denied migrants the ability to come into the US, where death was contemplated as part of a consequence, and where that consequence was meant to be a deterrent for would-be migrants who would say, hey, if those people are dying crossing through the deserts, then maybe I'm not going to make that same mistake. But in fact, which has been a failure. We have now over 8,000 people documented that have died since 1994, when Operation Gatekeeper was put in place under the Clinton administration, but really was a strategy of this prevention through deterrence that the Border Patrol developed after implementing certain strategies, both in El Paso, Texas, and in San Diego, California. And so before I end, I also, I don't like to end in suggesting that there's victimhood here. I've been able to see conversations with people that are in Tijuana, as well as people that are in San Diego, many of whom have had some very excruciating experiences migrating all the way to the border, is that there's a lot of, someone earlier mentioned resilience, but there's also a lot of resistance, there's a lot of solidarity. We see, for instance, actions that take place on the US side in support of migrants on the Mexican side that are essentially saying, we want the US to honor the opportunity for us to make an asylum claim. And so these actions that have taken over the course of many years, but highlighting over the past couple of years where we've seen some of the more dangerous policies in place, are really a way to lift up the challenges to this crimmigration, the challenges to policies that suggest that people's humanity should be questioned. That the challenges to the idea that border walls and militarization and state-sponsored violence should be an acceptable and tolerable response to people who are seeking safety. So I'll end there, and thank you for the opportunity again to provide some thoughts on this important topic.
Okay, with the remaining time that we have left, I certainly open the conversation to the audience. So we're willing to take any questions that you might have for the panelists.
I'll start out. My question is for Dr. Valdez. Considering the fact that you have a sample group of 32 universities, for one, I was really surprised that only 1/5 of all undocumented students are at University of California or Cal State system. My question is specific to more campus-specific findings. And I did the quick math. I know the end counts are going to get really, really low, but a couple of the UC schools are so measurably different. If you just think of comparing Cal Berkeley to, say, Fresno State in the sense of their kind of political and social climate around them. It would be really interesting if you could comment in any way about some findings specific to kind of across some of these more unique university campuses.
So thank you for your question. We do have the data from each campus site. As you know, sometimes there are difficulties with recruitment, and so that was one of the challenges that we experienced. And so while we did have over 1,000 students respond to our survey, one of the limitations that I said was that it's not very representative of the diversity with respect to undocumented students across the UC and CSU campuses. We also have a large student population of undocumented individuals who attend the California Community College system. We didn't survey them. With respect to interesting findings across different university groups, I don't have that information in front of me now. I'd be happy to share some of that. If you have specific questions, I can send you a little bit of information on that. But we controlled for the university type when we ran our models, but I didn't look specifically at, let's say, Fresno State versus UC Irvine or UC Davis. So I apologize that I don't really have a good response for that question, but that wasn't part of the analyses. We simply controlled for campus type.
Absolutely. No, I just thought when you were comparing, you're almost in a way underselling California's representativeness relative to some of these other very large state universities or states where there's a sizable state university system where they can be just as varied as UC and US or California state system. If you looked at, say, Texas or Florida or anything like that. So it was more just I just thought an interesting point.
Can I ask a question, Dr. Valadez? So I noticed in your study, I was surprised that you were able to conduct it during 2020 in the midst of the pandemic. I was wondering if maybe your analysis explored any of those questions and seeing if maybe students' isolation in universities was heightened during the pandemic.
Thank you for your question. Yes, thank you for catching that. We were trying very hard to work on this project during the pandemic, and we actually were able to make some adjustments to the survey to ask some questions related to the pandemic and how they were adjusting to some of what was going on. We know that undocumented individuals experience hardships that not everyone can really identify with, especially during that time when things were very stressful at the start of the pandemic, when there were a lot of unknowns. We didn't specifically look at COVID related questions in this study, but I was part of the authors on a report that came from the project itself, where students did describe some of the issues that they were experiencing with stress, with financial concerns. I think a lot of people assume that students have this private place to work and to study. And we saw that that wasn't necessarily the case for a lot of individuals who are living in very tight quarters with large families. They don't have the space or privacy, and that was a challenge that many of them expressed. So there were also some concerns about financial issues, and so that was something that was discussed in the survey itself, but not part of this actual study. And I'd be happy to share that report with you if you want to take a look at that.
Thank you.
Questions you guys have? Oh, sir, you have two. Okay. We defer to you guys first and foremost. Okay, fine.
What do you guys think federal law enforcement can do to improve the situations that's going on?
Were you able to hear that? Oh, maybe thank you.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
The question was whether or not, or what you thought federal agents could do or agencies could do to improve the situation. Specifically, I think down by the border, is that, okay.
Thank you for the question. I can try to answer that question. So I think to begin, it would be important to do away with the policies that continue to place people in harm's way. And the two specific policies that I mentioned are the Title 42 order that again uses the pandemic as an excuse to remove people without observing their due process rights. And the second one is the NPP, which is returning people to wait for their asylum claims in Mexico until they're called up. Both of them, there have been numerous, in fact, there's been thousands of documented cases of migrants that have faced some sort of abuse, whether including even murder, as a result of having to wait in Mexico because of these policies. And so it would be important for the Biden administration immediately to suspend and end those policies. Secondly, looking at the larger practice of a strategy of militarization that really has created conditions where there isn't a way of providing value to the uniqueness of border towns. You know, we see the consequences of that, where more money is funneled to building border walls in some places where there really isn't good even municipal services in towns in southern New Mexico, for instance. And so it's a question of priorities that needs to change in order to shift the policies that really lift up people's human rights. And ultimately, it would be about that. How do we center human rights as a practice to developing good policy for both migrants who are leaving very difficult situations, but also for those of us that live in border communities?
Hi, my name is Lee Ragsdale. I work with the Education Justice Project at the University of Illinois. I'm actually based in Michoacan, Mexico. I've been living here since my husband's deportation in 2013. And I just wanted to piggyback on what Pedro was talking about in terms of the experience of immigrants. So we have several friends here in Michoacan who've attempted to cross to the US, both legally and illegally. One just last week took off with $100. We said, no, let's get you some protein bars. Let's get you some dollars. He's a strawberry farmer here. And with climate change, he lost his entire crop. He's leaving his infant son behind. Really difficult situation. Long story short, they caught him and returned him, but not until he was robbed twice by Mexican cops, stripped naked. He's at the border with helicopters over him, just a super militarization like you're talking about. Another friend has a tourist visa. She travels legitimately to Chicago and LA to visit family. And she told me about a phenomenon where they're pulling off people from planes. So the plane arrives from Mexico. They take everyone who's working age and they review their cell phones for any kind of messages that might indicate they're intending to work during their visa. And all of this in the context of a labor shortage in the US, right? It blows my mind. Like, are there not efforts to create some kind of a migrant worker program to fill, I was in the States about 6 months ago and I see that the Starbucks closed at 4 p.m. now because there's not enough labor. It just seems like such a contradiction to me. So I'm just curious if there's any efforts to bring people legitimately to work in the States.
If I can try to answer that question as well. So the problem with guest worker programs have been that they're extremely exploitative. We have not seen a guest worker program that really highlights the need to support labor rights of the workers. And we've seen this going back for many years. My grandfather was a bracero, so going back to the bracero years where people that were coming across through El Paso were chemical agents, right? Not something unsimilar to what we see nowadays in terms of how migrants are dehumanized as when they're coming to workers. Even the term bracero breaks the person's humanity and just sees them as how they produce through their brazos, through their arms, right? And so I think that it's a good question for policymakers, if there's a way to ensure that labor rights are a priority for them so that they're not exploited. But I don't have the confidence that policymakers would prioritize the very basic labor rights of workers who would be coming in as guest workers. Even during the time of the Katrina hurricane, many of the workers that were working to rebuild that region were exploited, were housed in dilapidated rooms, were not being given the proper nutrition, proper pay for the work. And so I don't see that there would be equity in terms of how they would be treated if they were brought in as guest workers.
I have a question for those of you who study victimization. I'm curious as to what maybe programs or practices you think need to be instituted in order to address some of the both short and long-term consequences of victimization that individuals might experience, specifically within the immigrant population.
I could probably speak to that question. So I think one of the things that is a challenge is that currently, certainly on the mental health side, there's just a massive shortage of resources. That's one of them. I have a very small private practice. I would usually get maybe a call a month, people looking for services. Last week I got 4. So there's just a huge demand. There's not sort of much available. And so I think one of the things that we need to think about is alternative ways to provide support to the community as a whole, but then immigrants as well, that I think sort of leverages what some of the community agencies that are in those communities are doing. A lot of those agencies are great resources for legal assistance and educational programs and things like that. And I think using those agencies and really sort of growing them and providing them with additional resources is one way to start to at least provide a network of support for individuals who are going through this. I think the other one is that we really, once the pandemic hit, sort of the wave of mental health issues sort of closely followed. In communities that have been sort of stressed and individuals who've been experiencing that even before the pandemic hit, we're really going to be disproportionately impacted by that. And there's plenty of research out there showing us that those are folks who sort of took the brunt of a lot of this. And I think the expansion within the healthcare system in terms of, again, resources, alternative sort of outreach efforts and things like that really sort of are part of how we deal with that. We're at a point now where we really need to find creative ways to do this, because the traditional ways of handling this problem, there's just not enough resources out there to do it.
Sorry, we have to police the chat and the conversation a lot more closely now. So, Dr. Soltero, please feel free to ask your question.
Yes, I wonder if I could try to make a comment on the previous question. The person who had a relative or a husband who was deported to Mexico and looking for ways to get a visa to work in the US in the agricultural sector. Could I do that? It would be about the previous question.
Sure.
Okay, so what I understand is that there are different types of visas to work in the US, and there is one type of visa exclusively for agricultural workers. These visas were still being given to immigrants, especially from Mexico, even during the worst days of the Trump administration, because even though Trump was demonizing many immigrants, especially from Mexico and Central America, the fact of the matter is that the American economy, especially in the agricultural sector, still needs these immigrants. And therefore, Trump was allowing these visas to go to several countries, including Mexico, to this type of workers. As I understand, these visas are still there. Biden hasn't changed the policies of immigration from Trump very significantly, but the US now more than ever needs these workers. So my advice to the person that was calling, asking for information is this. I don't know where you live exactly in Michoacan, but if you live in Morelia, the capital city of the state, or close to Morelia, I would advise you to contact the Mexican government. They have offices especially dedicated to service migrants. And they have these offices in Michoacan because it is one of the states from Mexico that sends the largest numbers of immigrants to the US, especially to the area here in Chicago. So contact the Mexican government. Second, contact if there is a consulate of the American embassy in Morelia, Michoacan, contact them and ask them for the possibility of applying for agricultural sector visas for workers that come here to work in the agricultural sector. If you live close to Mexico City, it's even easier to go to the American Embassy on Reforma Avenue. And the last suggestion that I give to you is there is a very significant cluster of faculty at the University of Michoacan who are dedicated to study immigration and migration from Mexico to the US. So you can go to the Department of Sociology or some other departments and contact the faculty at the University of Michoacan in Morelia. Some of them are experts on immigration. Some of them deal with the issues that you are talking about, your husband, I understand. And ask them, what is the situation with visas for the agricultural sector, if indeed your husband wants to come and work in the agricultural sector. And they can provide you with this information as well. So those are my suggestions. Thank you.
Well, I think we're going to conclude our presentation at this moment. Thank you again to the presenters online. Both of our classes, the Crim 208 and the Crim 305, certainly your discussions advanced the topics and the learning objectives of that classes. So we thank you for that. Thank you for everyone in attendance and participation. Certainly wish you all a great day, and we'll be in conversation soon. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you, everyone.
If you didn't get my sign-in sheet, whoever has, yeah, thank you. Come find me. Thank you, guys.